The sound comes first, an uneven pulse echoing through the tiled chamber, reverberating against the walls like a sinister heartbeat. Then the smell of ether hits, sweet and suffocating, clinging to the air like rot masked beneath perfume. Something is profoundly wrong here. You sense it before a single word is spoken. A patient trembles on the table, wide-eyed and silent, as the doctor's gloved hands glisten with oil, slick in the flickering light. The gas lamp burns far too bright, casting shadows that twist and writhe like living things, stretching across the tiles as though eager to witness what is to come. Every movement feels ritualistic, deliberate, each clink of metal against metal, a drumbeat of impending horror. The air vibrates with tension, heavy and oppressive, suffocating the very breath from your lungs. You notice the small details too late. The way the doctor's smile curves unnaturally, the faint scratching of claws, or is it fingernails, against the floor beneath the table, the whisper of something alive in the dark corners. Time slows. The pulse grows louder. The chamber itself seems to lean closer, as if holding its breath for the inevitable. The ether thickens, clouding your vision, dragging your mind toward the edge of panic. Something unholy is about to be done, and there is no escape. This is not medicine. This is a ritual. This is terror dressed as care. And when it begins, you will understand why some rooms are meant to remain locked, and some experiments are never to be repeated. Before we go further, take a moment to like, subscribe, and tell me where you're listening from. These stories, strange, unsettling, half-buried in medical history, always find a way to crawl back into the present. Because in the heart of the Victorian age, the world's most respectable doctors believed they'd found a cure for madness, melancholy, and desire. Their instruments hummed, their patients shuddered, and under the guise of science, a quiet epidemic began, one of trembling hands and moral decay, disguised as medicine. You hear it before you see it. A faint hum, low and irregular, rising beneath the clatter of teacups and the soft shiver of the fire grate. The sound does not belong here, among the patterned drapes and lace-trimmed lampshades. It is a new sound, mechanical, restless, like something breathing through iron lungs. The house itself seems to listen to it. Even the maid pauses, her hand hovering over a polished silver tray, eyes flicking toward the closed door at the end of the hall. It is winter in London, 1891. The fog presses against the windows, heavy as damp wool, and the gaslights outside flicker weakly in their glass cages. Inside this room, time feels slower, measured by the whisper of silk, the stirring of tea, the tremor that rises again from the surgery below. Upstairs, Mrs. Evelyn Dorrington sits very still, her gloved fingers folded in her lap, her breath caught somewhere between patience and dread. Her husband, a merchant of fine goods, is away again, business in the north, as always. And she, afflicted by what the doctor calls nervous weakness, has been instructed to rest, to eat soft foods, and to report each week for treatment. Downstairs, Dr. Harland adjusts the brass fittings of his newest apparatus, a curious device of polished wood, rubber tubing, and a motor that purrs like a cat. He calls it the pelvic massage generator. The journals call it progress, but the noise it makes, the low, uneven vibration, sounds to him like something alive. He wipes his spectacles, checks the clock, and reminds himself that he is a man of science. The women who come to him, wives, daughters, the anxious and the unfulfilled, are simply patients, their symptoms medical, their relief mechanical. That is what he tells himself, at least, as he winds the cord and hears the faint, pleading buzz. The maid downstairs stirs, hearing it again. The vibration seems to pass through the floorboards, up the stair rail, into the bone. It is not loud, not constant, but persistent, like a whisper through fabric. In the parlor above, Mrs. Dorrington closes her eyes and listens to it too, though she does not quite know why. It unsettles her, yet draws her near. Her doctor says it is only a matter of nerves, a temporary imbalance of humors, a little tension that can be soothed away with patience and touch. She clings to that phrase, a cure of touch. Outside, a carriage wheel snaps through a puddle. The sound startles her, and the tremor below seems to answer, a pulse against the hush. Somewhere beneath her feet, something stirs that does not belong to illness or invention. It belongs to hunger. Not the crude kind, but the quiet one, the one that cannot be named without shame. By the time the clock strikes 4, the hum fades. The house exhales. The fire pops softly in the grate. Mrs. Dorrington opens her eyes and realizes her tea has gone cold. She rings the bell for her coat and steps into the fog, unaware that what began as treatment will become obsession. The tremor will return tomorrow, and the day after, and every day thereafter, until no one remembers whether it was meant to heal or to awaken. The first time she came to him, she nearly fainted on the threshold. Her husband carried her in like a parcel, whispering apologies for the trouble, though his eyes never once met hers. "She has spells," he murmured, "fits of silence, sometimes trembling." He said it as if describing a fault in furniture, a hinge too tight, a clock that lost its rhythm. Dr. Harland nodded, expression grave, and gestured toward the couch upholstered in soft green velvet. The woman, Mrs. Clara Finch, was not the usual kind. Most arrived tearful, eager for attention, but Clara simply stared at the floor as if the world beneath her shoes were threatening to open. Her hands were white and restless. When she finally sat, her breath caught high in her chest, shallow, uneven, as though the act of breathing itself was something she had forgotten how to do. Dr. Harland noted her pallor, the faint flutter at her throat, the tremor that rippled through her gloved fingers. "Tell me, madam," he began, voice low and professional, "do you experience heaviness in the limbs, sudden melancholy, palpitations?" She hesitated. "Yes, doctor, all of it." Her voice was soft, nearly swallowed by the ticking clock. "And in what moments do these symptoms arise?" Clara's lips parted, then closed again. Her husband shifted uncomfortably by the door. Harland, noting her struggle, waved him away with gentle insistence. "I think it best we continue privately." When the door clicked shut, something in the room changed, the air thickened. "I cannot breathe," she said again, this time with urgency. "Sometimes in the night, sometimes when I am alone, I feel something rise in me, heat or sorrow, I do not know which. It begins in the stomach and reaches the throat until I think I will choke." He nodded as though understanding perfectly. He had read this description before in journals, in case studies from Paris and Edinburgh. The language differed, but the verdict was always the same: hysteria, a disease of the womb, of the nerves, of women too delicate for the pressures of thought or silence. "I assure you, Mrs. Finch," he said, preparing his apparatus, "your condition is most treatable." He dimmed the lamps, adjusted the curtains, and set the device humming on the side table. The sound filled the room, a low, throbbing vibration that mingled strangely with the rhythm of her unsteady breathing. She watched it, wide-eyed, as he took her wrist, feeling for the pulse. "You must learn to let go," he murmured. "Your body holds what the mind cannot bear." The treatment began as all his did, with precision, with the steady calm of a man convinced of his virtue. But as minutes passed, the air seemed to thicken with something unsaid. Her breath deepened, her hands clenched, and a sound escaped her throat that was neither pain nor relief, but something in between. When it was over, she lay still. The hum of the machine subsided, but the silence that followed felt heavier than before. Dr. Harland wiped his hands, suddenly aware of the sweat on his brow. He told her to rest, to drink water, to return next week. At the door, she turned back. "Doctor," she whispered, voice trembling. "I think I breathed again." He bowed, expression fixed. Yet long after she left, he sat alone in the darkened room, listening to the echo of her voice and wondering, for the first time, whether he had cured her illness or awakened it. By spring, the word had begun to move like smoke through drawing rooms and surgeries, alike hysteria. No one spoke it loudly, but everyone knew it. It appeared in pamphlets, in medical ledgers, in whispers exchanged behind lace fans at afternoon teas. It was the polite language of unease, a diagnosis that made suffering respectable, domestic, containable. To have hysteria was to be fragile, sensitive, touched by the delicate madness of womanhood. To say the word aloud, however, was something else entirely. Dr. Harland first heard it uttered in full during a meeting of the Royal Medical Society. The room was thick with the scent of pipe smoke and pomade, the air humming with self-importance. One of the senior physicians, a grey man with watery eyes, read from a French journal describing hysterical paroxysms and the therapeutic manual approach that had achieved remarkable results in Paris. Around the table, the men nodded with grave approval, their fingers drumming on mahogany. Not one of them smiled, but something flickered between them, a tacit agreement, a thrill of ownership disguised as science. The condition, the reader continued, is rooted in the uterus itself, which in moments of stress or dissatisfaction may wander through the body, impinging upon the lungs, the heart, and even the mind. Laughter rose at that, the genteel practiced kind meant to mask discomfort. But Dr. Harland did not laugh. He thought of Mrs. Finch and the way her breath had caught in his hands, the way her eyes had filled with something rawer than relief. The word hysteria sounded harmless enough on the tongue, but it carried weight. It offered men like him authority over a mystery they did not truly understand. Later, as he walked home through the soot-thick streets, he found himself watching the women who hurried past in their veils and winter cloaks. How many of them, he wondered, had been told they were ill simply for feeling too much? How many husbands had nodded gravely, thankful for a cure that required neither tenderness nor comprehension? The diagnosis was a balm for everyone except the women themselves. In the weeks that followed, his waiting room filled. Mrs. Finch returned, paler but eager. Another patient arrived, then another, each with the same symptoms: sleeplessness, irritability, tears without reason, heaviness in the limbs. They came from all corners of the city: servants, school teachers, merchants' wives, all bearing the same quiet desperation. And in every case, the prescription was identical: rest, warm milk, isolation, and, when all else failed, the therapeutic manipulation. He recorded his successes carefully, each treatment noted in precise, clinical language. Duration, 12 minutes. Result, temporary relief. Patient reports emotional release and improvement in appetite. To an outsider, it would read like a triumph of medicine. But beneath those words, in the space between sentences, something darker pulsed, a truth too dangerous to name. The word hysteria spread beyond London. It reached Edinburgh, Boston, Vienna. It appeared in sermons, in editorials, in advertisements for health tonics and sanatoriums. It became a mirror in which every anxious woman was forced to see herself reflected. And as its power grew, so too did the industry that thrived upon it. Dr. Harland knew this, though he never said it aloud. Late at night, when the city had gone quiet, he would touch the brass shell of his humming machine and feel its faint vibration echo through the desk. The word had given him purpose, wealth, respect, but it had also given him something far less visible, a tremor that now lived in his own hands, one that no treatment could ever still. The first rule of any cure, Dr. Harland once told himself, was distance. A physician must never be moved by what he observes, never let the human face of suffering blur the lines of science. But distance, he had learned, was not so easily maintained when one's profession required touch, when the malady resided not in the body's organs, but in its silence. By summer of 1892, he had refined the treatment to an art. The women came in with trembling hands and eyes too weary to meet his gaze, and left flushed, composed, almost radiant. The case books grew thick with success. Mrs. G reports improved mood and sleep. Miss A, no longer confined to bed. Lady D writes that she feels reborn. He called it progress. The newspapers called it miracle. He knew, however, that it was neither. His office had changed with his reputation. Gone were the heavy curtains and plain furnishings. In their place stood machines, contraptions of nickel and rubber and leather straps. On the shelves rested jars of ether, tonic mixtures, and polished steel instruments that gleamed under the gaslight like relics of a mechanical faith. The air itself buzzed faintly from the electrical coils he had begun to experiment with for precision, he told patients, though he still preferred his own hands. The ritual unfolded the same way each time. A consultation, brief and polite. Questions about appetite, dreams, thoughts that intruded unbidden. Then the diagnosis, always the same. Your nerves are in revolt, madam. The system must be soothed. His tone was gentle, the authority practiced. Behind it, though, a kind of dread took shape, an awareness that he was not so much treating a disorder as performing one. In truth, the cure was little more than a controlled act of release. What the textbooks called paroxysm was simply a word to hide behind. No one had yet dared to define it, though every doctor knew precisely what it meant. Harland had once read that in certain circles, the experience was likened to a thunderstorm passing through the body, leaving calm skies in its wake. He found the comparison too poetic and too accurate. Sometimes, when the sessions ran late into the night, he would feel the city sink into silence outside his window. The fog would press against the glass, muting the clatter of hooves, the hiss of gas lamps. The machine would hum beneath his hand, a steady purr against the world's endless noise. And as he watched the women before him, faces soft with exhaustion, lips parted in surrender, he would tell himself it was medicine, nothing more. But conscience is a poor sleeper. In the hours after, when he stripped off his gloves and washed his hands in cold water, he often caught his reflection in the mirror, pale, damp, and unrecognizable. The distance he once prized had vanished. The work had crept into him, hollowed something out. The line between treatment and transgression had blurred until it was only a shadow cast by the gaslight. Still, he continued, each patient left satisfied, each note neatly written, each appointment already booked for the week ahead. And beneath the floorboards, the machine purred on, tireless and obedient, its soft vibration rising like prayer through the quiet of the house. The scent lingered long after the patients were gone, sweet, heavy, and deceptive. Ether had the softness of mercy at first, a cooling numbness that made trembling cease and thoughts dissolve into mist. But when it faded, it left behind something far more difficult to wash away. Dr. Harland kept a small bottle on his desk, stoppered with wax, its pale fumes curling through the study like an uninvited ghost. He told himself it was necessary a tool, nothing more, but even necessity has its smell, and this one reeked of deceit. The bottle had come to him from Paris, along with a letter from a colleague who spoke of tremendous advancements in female anesthesia. The French had gone further, he said. They experimented with gases and vapors to quiet patients, to make the work easier. No pain, no resistance, the letter promised. Harland read those words again and again, until the thought of a silent patient began to sound merciful. That winter, the cold crept into the walls. The fog rolled in from the river and settled in the city's lungs. The streets outside his practice turned grey with soot and horse dung. Inside, the brass lamps flickered as he prepared the next session. Mrs. Finch was due again, faithful, punctual, grateful. He found himself dreading her visits now, not because of the treatment, but because of her eyes. She had stopped looking sick. She smiled too easily. Her cheeks flushed as if some secret warmth had taken root beneath her skin. That evening, she arrived wrapped in a veil. Her husband waited outside in the carriage, staring straight ahead. She stepped inside and removed her gloves, her breath visible in the cold. Harlan noticed the faint tremor in her fingers and reached for the ether bottle almost instinctively. "A whiff," he said softly, "just to calm the nerves." She hesitated. "Must I, doctor?" He forced a smile. "Only for comfort." The moment the rag touched her lips, he felt something twist in his chest, a sigh, pulse of guilt so sharp it almost broke through his practiced calm. The vapor hissed faintly, and her lashes fluttered, her body relaxed, her shoulders sinking into the chair. The hum of the machine began, slow and rhythmic. In the dim light, her face looked peaceful, detached from the world. For the first time, Harland saw what they meant when they called it restoration. But in that peace, he felt none of his own. When it was over, he sat alone, staring at his hands. They smelled faintly of ether and skin. He had crossed another threshold that evening, though no one would ever know. Outside, the city was silent except for the toll of the midnight bell. The sound seemed to echo through him, hollow and accusing. He extinguished the lamps one by one, but the glow lingered in the mirrors. His reflection watched him from the dark glass, a man illuminated by his own deceit. He told himself again that it was medicine, that it was mercy, that it was necessary, but as he sealed the bottle and turned the key in the lock, he could still smell it sweet, cloying, inescapable. Ether and guilt, two perfumes of the same sin. By the spring of 1893, Dr. Harland's practice had become a place of quiet pilgrimage. Women arrived in closed carriages, their faces hidden beneath lace veils, each carrying the same letter from some physician or husband who could not or would not attend to their distress. The letters were polite, almost identical. The patient suffers from agitation, sleeplessness, melancholy, and nervous excitation. Kindly administer your proven method of relief. He kept them all, stacked neatly in a drawer that smelled faintly of lavender and ink, a growing archive of silent desperation. Outside, the city was changing. Telegraph wires hummed above the rooftops, electric trams hissed along the cobblestones, and the age of invention had begun to stir with feverish confidence. Men in laboratories were turning magnetism into profit and pleasure into science. Harland followed their work closely, marking passages in his journals about galvanic therapy and nervous stimulation. The language of discovery was seductive. It offered absolution in the shape of progress. The body, they said, was a system of currents. Nerves were merely wires, impulses were sparks. Illness was nothing more than misdirection, a fault in the flow of energy. Harland read the words late into the night, their certainty steadying him. If the body was a circuit, then his task was simply to restore balance. His hands were not sinful, they were instruments of conduction. He began to speak differently to his patients. "It is not you who are ill," he told them, "but your nerves, your electrical equilibrium. We must discharge the excess." The word discharge made some flinch, others blush. He pretended not to notice. In truth, the vocabulary comforted him. To frame desire as science was to cage it, to make it measurable, obedient. In his study, diagrams of the female body hung beside sketches of induction coils and dynamos. The two seemed to belong together now, flesh and dynamos, current, symptom, and spark. He experimented with new attachments, modified the machine's voltage, recorded pulse rates and durations with meticulous precision. The results were consistent: calm, relief, improvement. The case notes glowed with legitimacy, yet the nights afterward grew heavier, the silences longer. He had begun to notice patterns. Many women, after the treatment, wept quietly, not from pain, but from something deeper, unnamed. A few spoke afterward in half-dreamed sentences. "It felt like being remembered. I felt myself return." These remarks he did not record. They had no place in medical journals, no terminology that could contain them, but he remembered each one as vividly as any fever. The Royal Medical Society invited him to speak that summer. His lecture, on the therapeutic value of pelvic manipulation in hysterical women, drew polite applause. The words he used, neurological excitation, controlled paroxysm, vascular release, sounded dignified, almost holy. Not once did he say pleasure, not once did anyone ask. When he returned home that evening, the machine waited for him in the corner, still and glinting. He traced his fingers along its polished edge and felt the faint static on his skin. Outside, thunder rolled across the city, shaking the windows. The storm sounded almost human, a low, shuddering sigh, rising from deep within the earth. He poured himself a glass of brandy, staring into the dark. Science had given him every answer he asked for, except the one that mattered most. Why did the cure feel so much like desire? And why, beneath the hum of progress, did guilt sound so much like his own heartbeat? By the time the summer fog drifted over the Thames, London itself had become a city of fainting couches and prescriptions. The word hysteria hung over it like perfume everywhere, invisible and sweet enough to conceal the rot. In Mayfair and Bloomsbury, drawing rooms turned into miniature infirmaries. Bottles of tonics lined mantelpieces. Ether lamps flickered beside half-read novels. The city was whispering, but not speaking. Dr. Harland began to see the same faces again and again. Wives of barristers and bankers, daughters of retired colonels, girls barely 20 who had never once left their fathers' homes without escort. They all complained of the same symptoms: sleeplessness, melancholy, inexplicable restlessness, and that strange heaviness in the chest that seemed to have no cause and no cure. It was as if London's women had caught a fever of the soul, a sickness of too much silence. He took his morning walk through Grosvenor Square one day and watched them pass, each with the same deliberate posture, each trained to vanish inside her own composure. A pair of ladies paused by a fountain, their parasols trembling in the wind. They spoke in whispers, their laughter brittle and fleeting. And then, just as he turned the corner, he saw one of them sway the faintest, briefest collapse, as though something within her had simply given out. Her friend caught her at once, murmuring, "It's only her nerves." That phrase, like a blessing, absolved them both. Back in his surgery, the days stretched endlessly. The machine hummed, the curtains stayed drawn, the room smelled of lavender oil and fear. He found himself moving through the treatments like a man sleepwalking through ritual. The women came, one after another, leaving traces of perfume and tears. Some refused to meet his gaze. Others reached for his hand when it was over, whispering thank yous that sounded too intimate to bear. He noticed something else, too, something that unsettled him more than their trembling. When the sessions ended, and they stood again before the mirror to fix their hair, they no longer looked ill. Their eyes shone with a quiet defiance. Their bodies held a new kind of calm, as though the sickness had not been cured but merely translated into knowledge. It frightened him, that change. It meant they understood more than they let on. Outside, the newspapers wrote about progress and electricity, about how science was finally taming the mysteries of the female body. Clinics opened on every fashionable street. Doctors competed for patients, boasting of new devices, faster motors, more reliable results. London was healing, they said. But Harland knew better. He had begun to see the tremor return not in the women, but in himself. Each hum of the motor seemed louder, more accusing. Each cure felt less like salvation and more like confession. Late one evening, as the fog thickened outside, he heard footsteps pause beneath his window. Two women stood there, cloaked and whispering, glancing up toward his light. They were not frightened, they were waiting. And for the first time, he understood that the silence spreading through London was not weakness, it was gathering. The city was holding its breath, and sooner or later it would exhale. There was a saying among the physicians of Harley Street, "A steady hand cures all sins." It was meant as a boast, a surgeon's pride, but to Dr. Harland it had begun to sound like an accusation. His own hands, though unerring, had started to feel foreign to him, as if the muscles remembered things the mind wished to forget. Each touch had become ritual, each movement an echo of the last. And yet, not once in all his years of practice did his fingers ever tremble. That, he thought, might be the most damning thing of all. His reputation had grown beyond anything he'd imagined. The medical journals now referred to him as a pioneer in the treatment of female nervous disorders. His schedule was full weeks in advance. Servants arrived at dawn to prepare the rooms, polish the brass fittings, and heat the towels. By noon, the carriages began to line the street one after another, discreet and expensive. He moved from room to room, hour to hour, like a clockmaker winding the same mechanism again and again, restoring the same faint heartbeat to the same weary machine. He began to lose track of their names. The women became initials in ledgers: Mrs. P, Lady H, Miss L, each reduced to a pulse and a pattern of breath. He could chart them by sound alone now. The intake of air, the trembling exhale, the small involuntary cry that marked the end of each session. It was science, he reminded himself, but the rhythm of it had begun to feel disturbingly human. One afternoon, a new patient arrived, a woman in her 30s with a calm, unreadable face. She did not weep or tremble as the others did. Her name, she said, was Mrs. Violet Hensley. Her husband was a solicitor. Her symptoms were familiar: fatigue, sleeplessness, sudden bouts of emotion. But when he asked the usual questions, she interrupted softly. "Doctor, do you ever feel it too?" He looked up from his notes. "Feel what, madam?" "The emptiness after the cure." Her words caught him off guard. For a moment he could not answer. She watched him closely, her gaze sharp enough to draw blood. Then, as though nothing had been said, she removed her gloves and lay back upon the couch. The treatment began in silence. The machine hummed softly, filling the room with its strange, insect-like purr. He kept his focus fixed on the rhythm, on the precision of his touch, but her question lingered like perfume in the air, seeping into his lungs. "Do you ever feel it too?" When it ended, she did not thank him. She simply rose, straightened her skirt, and whispered, "You should." That night, his hands ached for the first time. He sat by the window, rubbing the stiffness from his fingers as rain streaked the glass. The city beyond looked blurred, unreal, its lights flickering like pulse beats in the dark. He realized then that his hands had never shaken because they had forgotten how. They were no longer his. They belonged to the work, to the lie, to the steady, merciless rhythm of the machine. And as the clock struck midnight, a tremor, small but unmistakable, finally passed through them. It was not weakness, it was awakening. By the end of autumn, the illness had become fashionable. Every newspaper, column, and medical circular carried advice for the restless female constitution. The city's apothecaries stocked shelves of tinctures, elixirs, and powders, each promising to soothe the body and quiet the mind. For sleeplessness, 1 drachm of chloral hydrate. For melancholy, a spoonful of laudanum before bed. For faintness, ether on a rag. But when these failed, and they always did, the doctors had their own prescription, written in impeccable script: therapeutic manipulation, twice weekly, until improvement observed. Dr. Harland could not walk a single street now without seeing the evidence of his profession, staring back at him from shop windows, advertisements for nervous restoratives and female invigorators. The language was always the same: delicate, respectable, drenched in euphemism. Even the churches had begun to mention hysteria from the pulpit, framing it as proof of woman's moral frailty. He sometimes wondered if the whole city was conspiring to keep its women half sick. Inside his practice, the rituals continued. Each patient carried her own silence into the room, setting it down like a parcel beside the couch. Some came reluctantly, others with a kind of trembling anticipation, all left with the same faint glow, an afterimage of peace that would fade before morning. The women began to refer to it among themselves as the hour of calm. The phrase reached Harland's ears in fragments, carried by servants and gossip, as if the city itself had given his work a name. He found little comfort in it. The calm they spoke of did not last. Some patients returned within days, eyes dull, voices thin with exhaustion. Others vanished entirely, their husbands sending word that they were recovered or no longer in need. He knew what that meant. Recovery, in such circles, often meant resignation. The cure was never meant to heal, it was meant to contain. One evening, as he reviewed his ledgers, he realized he had stopped recording their names altogether. The columns were neat, clinical, almost mathematical. Duration, reaction, effect. Nothing of the person remained. It struck him that his records now resembled prayer lists, each entry a soul briefly acknowledged, then forgotten. Mrs. Finch returned that week, pale and distracted. Her eyes no longer shone, her voice was smaller. "I think I am worse," she whispered. "When I am home, the silence hurts me." He told her what he always told them, that recovery was not a straight path, that patience was required. But she shook her head. "You don't understand, doctor. I cannot bear to be untouched." Her words unsettled him more deeply than he expected. After she left, he sat alone in the dim light, surrounded by the instruments of his trade glass jars, metal coils, bottles of ether. The air smelled faintly of rosewater and oil. He felt the weight of every prescription he had ever written pressing upon him, an invisible stack of human longing disguised as medicine. Outside, the rain began again, tapping against the panes like a heartbeat. He closed the ledger and stared into the dark. For the first time, he wondered if the illness he treated was not theirs at all, but his. Something hollowed out within him, day by day, disguised as purpose. The prescriptions he wrote were not for the body, nor even for the soul. They were for silence. And silence, he now understood, was the most addictive cure of all. It was unlike any instrument he had used before, sleek, compact, and unnervingly alive. The machine arrived one winter morning in a wooden crate from Manchester, packed between straw and a letter embossed with the seal of an electrical company. "Our newest model," the note proclaimed, "portable, efficient, and precise. Recommended for practitioners specializing in the treatment of hysteria and other nervous afflictions." The phrasing made Dr. Harland's stomach tighten. Efficiency and precision were virtues in surgery, but in this work they sounded cruel. He assembled it slowly that afternoon, turning each brass screw as if winding a clock. The hum began the instant the current touched the coil, a low, undulating sound that filled the room like breath. The vibration pulsed through the table, gentle at first, then deepening into a steady rhythm that seemed almost organic. It frightened him. Machines were meant to obey. This one sounded as though it desired something. The first patient to encounter it was Mrs. Finch. She arrived pale, drawn, and more fragile than before. The old manual treatments, she said, no longer calmed her. Her nerves returned each morning with redoubled strength, like a fever that refused to break. "Then, perhaps," Harland murmured, "it is time we tried something new." He guided her to the couch, adjusted the controls, and pressed the device gently against her abdomen. The response was immediate. Her body arched slightly, breath catching in her throat. The hum deepened, and the sound of it filled the room with a strange intimacy, like the sigh of an unseen creature between them. He focused on the rhythm, keeping his expression clinical, detached. The journals had promised swifter paroxysm, reduced physician fatigue. They had not mentioned how human it would sound. When it ended, she lay trembling, silent, her eyes open and unfocused. He turned the switch, and the hum subsided into stillness. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then she sat up slowly and whispered, "It feels different, as if it knew where to go." Her words unsettled him. He placed the machine back on its stand, wrapped its cord neatly, and said nothing. But that night, long after she had gone, he returned to the room and switched it on again, not to use, only to listen. The hum rose and fell like a heartbeat, steady and unrelenting. He stood there in the half-light, imagining all the other rooms across London where similar devices now stirred, all the other doctors standing in the same silence. By spring, the machines had become indispensable. They replaced the trembling hands of men who once called themselves healers. Clinics advertised them openly now. Electric therapy for female exhaustion. Discreet, reliable, restorative. Harland's colleagues praised him for embracing modernity. Progress, they called it. But at night, when the house grew still and only the machine remained awake, he could not shake the feeling that something ancient had been awakened inside the brass and wires. It moaned softly, endlessly, as if the city's own suppressed longing had found a voice at last. And every time he heard it, the guilt inside him stirred patient, rhythmic, and alive. By the mid-1980s, electricity had become London's new religion. It powered the lamps that lined the streets, the trams that hissed through the fog, the telegraphs that pulsed like veins across the city's skin. The newspapers called it the light of progress, but to Dr. Harland it was something darker, an invisible force that crept beneath doors and into minds, replacing warmth with hum, faith with current. His own surgery had transformed into a small cathedral of wires. Copper coils hung like garlands from the ceiling. The air smelled faintly of ozone and rose oil. Each table was fitted with its own device now, some powered by steam, others by electric battery. The machines sang in harmony, a quiet chorus of whirring and sighing that filled the house from cellar to attic. Even at night, when the switches were thrown and the gas lights dimmed, he swore he could still hear them humming under the floorboards, as though dreaming. The patients came in greater numbers than ever before. They arrived with testimonials clipped from society papers, praising the miraculous electric treatments of Dr. E. Harland. Many brought their friends, some even their daughters, eager to prove that their ailments were fashionable, not shameful. In the waiting room, they sat in silence, each listening to the faint hum that drifted through the walls. It was no longer a secret sound, it was the sound of modern medicine. Harland had begun experimenting with steam pressure and alternating current, trying to make the effect more efficient, more controlled. The journals praised him for it, but each refinement only made the sensation more unpredictable. The vibrations no longer obeyed the body. They seemed to anticipate it, to rise and fall with the rhythm of breath, to mimic life itself. He had started to wonder whether the energy that passed through those wires was simply mechanical, or whether it borrowed something from those it touched. Late one evening, while testing a new induction coil, a spark leapt from the apparatus to his hand. The jolt was sharp but brief, a flash of heat followed by a peculiar trembling that travelled up his arm and into his chest. For a moment, his heart stuttered. He caught his reflection in the darkened window, his face pale, eyes wide, mouth slightly open. It had felt impossibly like the very thing he had spent years administering, a pulse of release, both violent and calm. He sat there in the dim light, breathing hard, the smell of burnt dust in the air. The realization came slowly, like the settling of ash. He was no longer sure where the body ended and the machine began. In the weeks that followed, he began to notice subtle changes. His patients spoke more freely now, their voices unguarded, almost tender. Some even laughed a low, breathless laughter that unsettled him more than tears ever had. They no longer seemed ashamed of their treatments. They called the sensation cleansing, reviving, divine. The word sin had quietly disappeared from their vocabulary, replaced by something dangerously close to faith. Outside, the city glowed brighter each night, a web of light stretching across rooftops and riverbanks. Steam hissed, wires buzzed, machines purred. It all seemed to whisper the same thing, that the age of restraint was ending and the age of electricity had begun. And in that new light, Harland saw his reflection more clearly than ever. A man who had tried to master desire, only to feed it with wires and steam until it learned to live without him. It began as a curiosity of engineering, not medicine. Or so the men liked to say. In the lecture halls of the Royal Society, gentlemen in pressed coats gathered around a table to witness the demonstration of a new electromechanical therapy device. The inventor, a man named Sir Alaric Dunscombe, stood before them with the pride of a conjurer unveiling his trick. The instrument gleamed beneath the gaslight, a cylinder of brass and ivory, connected by wires to a humming generator. Its surface quivered with gentle precision. "Observe," Dunscombe declared, his voice carrying through the crowded room. A regulated pulse, steady, tireless, efficient. The physician's own fatigue is removed from the equation entirely. The men leaned closer, nodding, murmuring approval. No one asked the obvious question: what kind of treatment demanded such motion? No one mentioned the women whose ailments had made this contraption necessary. To do so would be indecorous. They spoke instead of voltage, resistance, talk, of progress and profit. The language of invention was clean, antiseptic, safe. They called it the future of moral medicine. Dr. Harland had been invited as a guest, though he had nearly refused. He sat at the back of the hall, hat in hand, listening to the applause that followed each demonstration. The device was sleek, self-contained, and precise, better than his own cumbersome models, and quieter, too. He could not help but feel a flicker of admiration, but behind that admiration lurked unease. When the machine came to life, it emitted a sound. He recognized instantly a low, familiar hum that seemed to carry breath inside it. Afterward, as the crowd dispersed, one of the younger doctors clapped him on the shoulder. "Magnificent, isn't it? The first invention that truly frees the hand. No more arm manual fatigue." He grinned knowingly, and Harland managed a thin smile in return. The following week, Dunscombe's device appeared in every medical catalogue in London. It was marketed not to patients, but to practitioners, a gentleman's instrument for the efficient relief of female hysteria. Its advertisement featured diagrams of nerves, sketches of graceful women draped in sheets, their expressions serene, eyes closed in healing repose. No one spoke of the truth that simmered beneath the art. The machine had been designed to perform what men were beginning to fear, the intimacy they could no longer name. Soon, every respectable doctor owned one. The price alone guaranteed discretion. Clinics across the city buzzed faintly with identical hums, each one a chorus of denial disguised as progress. The work became easier, faster, more profitable. The men congratulated themselves on their invention. Harland purchased one, of course. He had to his patients expected the latest in modern treatment, but when he unpacked it and placed it on his desk, he could not bring himself to touch it. It looked less like an instrument of healing and more like a confession carved into brass. That night, as he walked home through the lamplit fog, he thought of all those shining devices, humming in secret rooms across London. They were no longer tools of medicine. They were mirrors, reflecting back the truth Victorian men could not face, that the boundary between cure and desire had never been real at all. It had only been engineered. The room was never fully dark. Even when the lamps were turned low, a faint orange glow bled through the frosted glass shades, soft enough to flatter, harsh enough to reveal. Gaslight had its own temperament. It flickered when the pressure dipped, hissed when the weather changed, and trembled like a living thing whenever the air grew heavy with breath. Dr. Harland had learned to work by that wavering light, its color coating every face in a sheen of amber melancholy. The gaslight did strange things to the women too. Under its glow they looked both fragile and eternal statues caught halfway between marble and flesh. He would see them lying there on the treatment couch, eyes closed, lashes trembling, the faint reflection of flame dancing across their skin. The light made their pale throats shimmer, turned the sheen of sweat on their temples into something dangerously close to beauty. He hated it for that. The light betrayed him. It made everything seem sacred. That evening, Mrs. Hensley returned the woman whose composure had unsettled him weeks before. She had the kind of calm that refused to break, a stillness that made the air itself uneasy. "You've improved since your last visit?" he asked. "I've felt less numb," she replied, her eyes fixed on the brass fittings of the new electric machine. "It's a curious thing, Doctor. The treatment, it quiets something, but it also stirs something else awake." He hesitated. "You mustn't overthink your recovery, Mrs. Hensley. It can unsettle the balance." "Perhaps imbalance is not always illness," she murmured. He said nothing. The words struck him like a chill draft in a sealed room. He adjusted the light, letting the flame flare, and the shadows on the wall began to twist and shudder, making the instruments gleam like relics from a forgotten ritual. When the treatment began, the machine's hum merged with the faint hiss of gas. The two sounds together formed a rhythm, mechanical, steady, inescapable. His hands moved by instinct, each motion careful, deliberate. Mrs. Hensley's breath came unevenly, a soft counterpoint to the machinery. Then, as the hum deepened, Her hand reached upward and found his wrist. Not a grasp, just a touch, light as a thought. He froze. The contact was brief, but electric. For a moment, the whole room seemed to hold its breath. The gaslight flickered violently, throwing his shadow against the wall, taller, monstrous, split in two. When it was over, she sat up slowly, her face calm, her voice steady. "You see, doctor," she said, smoothing her dress, "the light trembles too. Even it cannot pretend not to feel." He did not reply. The room was silent now except for the faint hiss of the gas mantle, still burning, still alive. She left without another word, the door closing softly behind her. He stood there a long while, staring at the table. The air was thick with the mingled scents of ether, ozone, and perfume. The gaslight swayed slightly in the draught, as though breathing, and in that trembling glow, he understood something terrible, that the room itself had become complicit. It was no longer a place of science. It was a confessional. Every flicker of light bore witness. Every flame remembered. The postbag in Dr. Harlan's hallway had grown heavier than it once was. It no longer contained invoices, requests from colleagues, or notes from suppliers of ether and glass syringes. Now, it was full of letters written in delicate, slanted handwriting, some on perfumed paper, others smudged and creased as if clutched too tightly before being sent. None of them were addressed to him by name. They were marked simply, "To the doctor," or "To the man who listens." He never answered them. He couldn't. It would have been improper, indecent even. Yet he read every word. They were not love letters, not exactly. They were confessions, disguised as gratitude. "You saved me from myself. I finally sleep without dread. My husband says I smile again." But between those sentences, like seams splitting under pressure, other words appeared. "I think of you when the house goes quiet. I dream," the hum continues. "Sometimes I pretend to be ill again." He stored them in a drawer, meaning to burn them eventually, but each time he reached for the matches, his hand stopped. There was something alive inside those pages, something the women could not say in their drawing rooms or their pews. They were not writing to the doctor. They were writing to the only man who had witnessed the part of them society refused to see. One night, when the fog pressed thick against the windows and the gaslights burned dim, Harlan found a letter that stopped him cold. It was unsigned, written in a steady, educated hand. "You may not remember me among so many, but I remember the sound of the room. You spoke gently, but I could hear something else beneath your words, a tremor, like fear. You told me to breathe. I did, and for the first time, I felt real. Do you ever wonder what we are curing, doctor? Or whom?" He read it 3 times, the last line sinking deeper with each repetition. Or whom? The question gnawed at him. What if hysteria was not a sickness of women, but of men, a mirror reflecting the century's own denial? The next day, he carried the letter in his coat pocket, like contraband. He went about his appointments as usual, the hum of the machines filling the house, but the words followed him. Each time a patient exhaled, each time the room fell silent, he imagined the unseen women across London writing by candlelight, sealing their pain in envelopes they could never send home. Toward evening, he stood by the fire, reading the letter once more before finally striking a match. The paper curled black at the edges, the ink turning to smoke, but the smell of burning ink filled the room with something disturbingly familiar, sweet, faintly metallic, like the air after one of his treatments. He thought of all those letters still waiting in their hidden drawers and cupboards, unsigned and unsent, written to a man who did not exist outside the walls of his surgery. He imagined them glowing faintly in the dark, like embers beneath the polite surface of London society. Each one a confession, a heartbeat, a ghost. That night, he dreamed of paper catching fire. The smoke filled the hallways, and behind the curling letters, he could hear a sound rising, not the hum of his machines, but the quiet, unstoppable sound of women remembering how to speak. 4 o'clock had become sacred. Not officially. Of course, there were no prayers, no bells, no psalms, but by that hour, The light slanted through the window in just the right way, turning the dust in the air into a shimmering haze. The servants moved quietly, the street noise softened, and the house seemed to fold in on itself, cocooned in stillness. It was the hour when women came to be cured. Dr. Harland had not chosen the time deliberately, yet it had evolved into ritual. His patients often requested it, as if drawn by something they could not name. They called it the calm hour. Even the city outside seemed to hush for it, the clatter of carriages fading, the hum of industry dissolving into a faint murmur beyond the walls. Inside, the lamps glowed low, the curtains drawn to filter the sun into a pale gold. The faint ticking of the wall clock became the metronome of the work. That afternoon, it was Mrs. Finch again. She had begun to tremble before even lying down, her eyes glistening with something that was not quite fear. "I can't explain it," she whispered as she removed her gloves. "It feels as though something calls to me when I walk past your door. I'm not well until I hear the hum." He swallowed the unease rising in his throat. "You must not grow dependent on the treatment," he said. "It is meant to restore balance, not replace it." She smiled faintly. "Isn't balance just another word for surrender?" Her words struck him more deeply than he cared to admit. The phrase echoed in his head as he adjusted the machine's dial, the low vibration beginning to fill the room. It was a familiar sound by now, yet each time it began, it changed the air, thickened it, slowed it. He had read once that sound could alter the rhythm of the heartbeat. He wondered if it altered the rhythm of morality too. As the treatment began, he kept his eyes fixed on the movements of his hands. He knew every detail of the process, the pressure, the intervals, the careful restraint that marked professionalism. But lately, restraint had begun to feel like performance. The women no longer flinched from the intimacy. They leaned into it, trusting him, perhaps too much. The moment of paroxysm, once a clinical endpoint, now felt more like revelation. He would watch their faces soften, their bodies release, and feel something inside himself recoil. When it was over, Mrs. Finch lay still, her breathing shallow but steady. The silence that followed was always the same, thick, almost reverent. She opened her eyes slowly and whispered, "Do you ever feel it too, doctor?" The stillness after. He didn't answer. He couldn't. The truth was, he did feel it, the eerie calm that lingered after the hum died, like the silence following confession. It filled the room long after she left, long after the lamps were extinguished. He sat alone at the table, the machine beside him still warm, faintly ticking as it cooled. The air smelled of ozone and lavender, the mingled scents of progress and sin. Outside, the bells of St. Mary's tolled the hour. 4 chimes. The sound bled through the walls, steady, final, almost kind. He realized then that he had built not a clinic, but a chapel. The women came not for medicine, but absolution. And he, the man who believed himself a scientist, had become their priest. It began with a rumor, small, quiet, almost shy at first. A woman in Kensington who no longer needed her treatments. Another in Islington who had not fainted or wept in weeks. A third who had left her husband altogether. The whispers drifted through parlors and sewing circles, carried on perfume and gossip. They said Dr. Harland's methods were so effective that his patients emerged, changed. At first, he took it as compliment. Who wouldn't? A doctor measured his worth in recovery. But as the weeks passed, the tone of the letters began to shift. Husbands wrote in stiff, uneasy prose, "My wife is different, restless, distant." One man even visited in person, his hat crushed between his hands, his voice trembling with anger. "You've made her strange," he said. "She looks at me like a stranger in my own house." Harland had no reply. He merely apologized, promised discretion, and shut the door. Yet the words lingered, circling his mind like moths around a flame. "You've made her strange." Mrs. Finch was the first he truly noticed. She came to her appointments with a new composure, no tremors, no tears. Her eyes had lost that glassy, helpless sheen. They gleamed now with something sharp, deliberate. When he asked about her symptoms, she smiled faintly and said, "There are none." "Then you're cured," he replied automatically, reaching for his ledger. "Perhaps," she said, standing, "or perhaps I've simply stopped mistaking desire for disease." He froze. She adjusted her hat, pulled on her gloves, and added, "I'm moving to Bath, my husband doesn't know yet." And just like that, she was gone. After her came others, women who spoke softly, but walked with a new certainty. Some stopped returning altogether. A few sent notes of gratitude, the sort written by the newly converted to a cause they could never quite name. One, unsigned, read simply, "You gave us back our breath." The newspapers soon caught the scent. An article appeared in the Illustrated London Gazette, its title coy but damning, "The Ecstatic Cure. Are Women Being Healed or Awakened?" Beneath it, a caricature showed a trembling lady surrounded by a halo of lightning bolts, while a shadowy doctor turned a crank behind her. The satire stung. He tore the paper into strips, but its echo followed him into every conversation. Even his colleagues grew cautious. At the society meetings, their greetings were shorter, their smiles tight. He overheard one whisper, "It's not medicine anymore, it's contagion." Late one night, unable to sleep, Harlan descended to the surgery and lit the lamps. The machine sat silent, gleaming faintly in the dim light. He touched the switch. The hum began low, rhythmic, familiar. Once, he had found it soothing. Now, it sounded like a heartbeat that wasn't his. He sat beside it for hours, listening. He thought of Mrs. Finch's voice, calm and unafraid, and of the countless women who had lain beneath this same light, trembling not from weakness, but from awakening. The hum seemed to grow louder until it filled the room entirely. The cure had worked. It had done exactly what it promised. It had restored life. But the life it restored no longer needed him. And as the machine thrummed on, steady and certain, he realized what terrified him most was not that the women had changed. It was that they were finally breathing without him. The house had begun to listen. Dr. Harlan felt it most in the still hours between dusk and midnight when the lamps burned low, and every sound seemed amplified. The slow creak of a stair, the soft drag of cloth against wood, the faint click of a latch. His servants moved more quietly now, as if they feared to disturb whatever unseen current flowed through the place. Perhaps they did. The walls, the floors, the very timbers seemed charged with the hum that had once belonged only to his machines. Rumors had begun to seep through those walls too, drifting from patient to servant to neighbor, a butler dismissed for gossip, a maid caught eavesdropping at the parlor door, a cabman overheard saying the doctor's house was haunted by sighs. The whispers spread, growing with every telling. No one said the word orgasm not aloud, not in a city that still measured its virtue by silence, but everyone understood. The women came pale and left flushed. They arrived trembling and departed lighter. Whatever happened inside those curtained rooms was working too well. One morning, Harlan found his maid, Ruth, standing in the hallway outside the surgery, her dust cloth limp in her hand. She was staring at the door as though it might open of its own accord. "Have you lost something?" he asked, trying for calm. She started, her cheeks blooming red. "No, sir, I thought." She stopped, glancing down the corridor. "Sometimes when the doors closed, it sounds like voices." He frowned. "Voices?" She nodded, eyes darting toward the polished floorboards. "Not speaking, sir, more like breathing." He dismissed her, but the words clung to him all day. That evening, he waited until the house had gone still, then stood outside the surgery himself, listening. The hum was faint but constant, like a trapped bee inside the walls. Yet beneath it, yes, there it was, a rhythm of breath, rising and falling in perfect time. He pushed the door open, half expecting to find someone there. The room was empty. Only the faint heat of the machine lingered, and the ghostly scent of lavender and sweat. The next week brought new unease. A neighbor, a clergyman, sent word that he wished to speak privately on a matter of reputation. Another patient cancelled abruptly, citing her husband's disapproval. Even the post began arriving later. the postman avoiding his eyes. And yet, amid the growing suspicion, more women came. Some appeared in veils, others at dusk, when the fog could hide them. They came not as patients, but as pilgrims, drawn by word of something beyond medicine. They spoke softly, often not at all, as if afraid that words might profane the mystery they sought. The corridor outside his surgery grew worn by their steps, the carpet threadbare where they waited. Harland began to dread the sound of the bell. 3 low chimes, always precise, always at the same hour. Each one sounded like confession. One evening, as the clock struck 4, he stood at the top of the stairs and looked down at the hallway below. It was empty, yet he could feel them there, their absence as tangible as presence. The whispers had reached his house, yes, but now they seemed to live inside it, murmuring just beneath the hum of the machines. He thought of Ruth's words, "It sounds like breathing." Perhaps it was. Perhaps the house itself had learned to inhale the secret it had sheltered for too long, and sooner or later, he knew, it would exhale. By the spring of 1894, hysteria had ceased to be an illness. It had become an industry. What had begun in the dim quiet of private surgeries was now a city-wide enterprise, advertised in polished glass and gold lettering. Electrotherapeutic salons for ladies, restorative clinics for the nervous temperament, steam baths for the faint and weary. The words were careful, respectable, draped in euphemism, like lace over scandal. Behind each curtain, the same hum filled the air, the same rhythm, the same promise of relief. Dr. Harland watched it unfold with disbelief. The medical journals overflowed with papers from every corner of England, doctors claiming miraculous recoveries through electricity, vibration, massage, and manipulation. A man in Manchester boasted of treating 60 women a week. Another in Edinburgh declared hysteria the most profitable disorder of the modern age. New devices arrived monthly by post, each one sleeker, faster, more discreet. Some ran on gas, others on battery. The advertisements showed them gleaming beside bottles of perfume and sewing kits, indistinguishable from the ornaments of domestic life. He saw one in a shop window once, between a set of hairbrushes and a crystal vase. A brass cylinder, coiled in silver wire, labeled simply, "Home Therapeutic Massager for Ladies' Nervous Complaints." A young wife lingered before it, gloved hands folded, her expression unreadable. When she caught him staring, she smiled faintly, almost conspiratorial, and stepped inside the shop. Even the newspapers joined in. Editorials debated the virtue of such treatments, though always from the safe distance of medical abstraction. If women are calmer, more obedient, and better mothers as a result of therapy, one article concluded, surely the methods need not be discussed in public. The line made him shudder. The city had found a way to sanctify silence. Meanwhile, his waiting room overflowed. Patients arrived from out of town, some traveling days by train. A woman from Liverpool wrote that her physician had prescribed an appointment with the celebrated Dr. Harland of London. Another from Sussex begged for instruction on how to bring the method home. The demand was relentless. The machines ran from morning until well after dark, their soft hum filling the house like the steady breathing of a beast. But what disturbed him most were his colleagues. Men who once dismissed his work as indecent now praised him openly. They wrote him letters full of admiration, even envy. "You've done what none of us dared," one wrote. "You've given the age its cure." He no longer knew whether it was praise or condemnation. One evening, he stood by his window and looked out at the city stretching beneath the fog. He could see the lights of a dozen other practices glowing faintly through the haze. He imagined the rooms inside, machines humming, curtains drawn, doctors moving like priests through their rituals. Each hum joined the next, merging into a single, unseen vibration that seemed to pass through the streets themselves. London had become a living engine of desire, disguised as medicine. The empire had found its heartbeat, and it pulsed beneath the gaslight, steady and sure. He closed the curtains, shut his eyes, and tried to imagine the silence that had existed before it began. He couldn't. The sound had entered him, as permanent as blood, and for the first time, he understood that what the Victorians called cure was merely contagion refined, mechanized, and multiplied. The empire of hysteria was no longer his creation. It belonged to the age itself. It was the autumn of 1894 when Dr. Harland realized his name had become a brand. His treatments, once whispered of in the corridors of the nervous and despairing, were now advertised in the same breath as patent medicines and luxury corsets. The morning papers ran columns of advertisements beside sketches of smiling women, serene, decorous, faintly glowing with that air of wellness. Victorian society found both desirable and safe. Beneath the drawings were phrases like "restoration for the modern lady" or "the Harland method approved by the most distinguished practitioners of London." He hadn't written them, yet there they were, every morning, in print. At first, he tore the pages to shreds. By the third week, he stopped. What use was protest when the city had already bought the lie? His colleagues had turned it into commerce. In clubs and drawing rooms, they spoke not of medicine, but of margins, how much they charged, how quickly they could restore balance, which class of women paid best, and which required discretion. Some hired assistants to manage the flow of patients, others sold electrical home kits for private use, promising instant tranquility in the privacy of one's own chambers. They congratulated themselves on liberating women from asylums, never noticing they had simply moved the walls closer. Manufacturers joined in next. Factories in Birmingham and Sheffield began mass-producing the instruments, wrapping them in velvet boxes embossed with gold lettering. The catalogues called them personal restorers, vital stimulators, pneumatic harmonizers. Every name was another layer of denial. A few were even fitted with jeweled handles or ivory casings, status symbols for the discreetly enlightened. Harland walked through Piccadilly one morning and saw them displayed openly in shop fronts, machines that moaned softly when switched on, their hum faintly audible even through glass. Shoppers passed without a glance, as if the sound had become part of the city's background music. He paused before one display and felt his reflection merge with the machine's polished surface. For a moment, he couldn't tell where the man ended and the invention began. That evening, a letter arrived from a manufacturer in Manchester, offering him a percentage of profits for the right to print, endorsed by Dr. Harland, on every box. The amount was obscene. He stared at the check for a long time, the ink shimmering beneath the lamp. He knew he should tear it up. Instead, he placed it in a drawer beside the letters from his patients, the confessions written in trembling hands. Money and longing, side by side. Soon even the language of the city began to change. The women who once spoke of treatments now spoke of sessions. The men no longer called it illness, but maintenance. The terminology of commerce had replaced the vocabulary of suffering. London itself seemed to pulse with appetite, masked by the rhythm of enterprise, and yet, beneath the veneer of progress, something raw stirred. There were protests in certain districts, clergymen condemning mechanical immorality, pamphlets distributed at church doors, warning that science had unfastened the gates of sin. Still, the demand grew. One night Harland sat alone in his surgery, the check open before him, the hum of his latest machine trembling softly in the air. He poured himself a glass of brandy and watched the liquid tremble with every pulse of current. He had built a business, a phenomenon, an empire, and lost the meaning of medicine somewhere inside it. Outside, the wind rattled the window panes. The street below glowed with lamplight and motion, the city alive with its own secret commerce. And for the first time, he realized the truth that had been circling him all along. The cure had never been about healing. It had always been about pleasure refined, packaged, and sold to those who could afford not to name it. By the turn of 1895, London had fallen in love with its own reflection. The advertisements no longer hid behind the language of discretion, they celebrated it. Illustrated catalogues depicted women reclining on fainting couches beneath halos of electric light, their faces serene, their hair unpinned. The The captions called them restored, radiant, reborn. The machine that once hummed behind closed doors had become a symbol of progress, purity, and modern grace. Harland saw the posters everywhere on the sides of trams, pasted over brick walls, even printed on the wrapping paper in chemists' shops. Electric therapy, a new dawn for the feminine spirit. Beneath the slogan, angels floated through clouds of golden light, their wings outstretched like filaments. Each held a small shining device in her hands. He could not look at them for long. Those angels haunted him. They were mechanical saints, selling holiness disguised as current, forgiveness disguised as pleasure. The machines had multiplied. New models flooded the market, some elegant, others grotesque in their enthusiasm. There were portable versions for the home, steam-powered restorers, and even one that promised simultaneous relief for two. Men bought them as gifts for their wives, relieved to hand over the task of affection to brass and wire. Women, in turn, spoke of them as companions, machines that asked nothing, judged nothing, and obeyed every impulse. The advertisements turned this obedience into divinity. They promised light in the body, calm in the mind, and virtue in the soul. The angelic imagery spread quickly. Cherubs made of electricity, halos of filaments glowing above smiling faces. To the public, electricity had become innocence itself. Its touch could not be sin, for it came from science. But inside Harland's house, the angels faltered. He had begun to hear the hum, even when the machines were off, a phantom vibration that followed him through the corridors. Some nights it came from the walls, other nights from inside his own chest. His sleep was shallow, his dreams feverish. He saw his patients' faces bathed in golden light, their eyes wide, mouths parted, not in pain, not in relief, but in recognition. They looked at him as though he were not a man at all, but one of those angels, beautiful, hollow, and merciless. His servants had started to leave, one by one. Ruth, the maid, was the last to go. Before she left, she said quietly, "Sir, it's the sound. It never stops." He told himself she was superstitious. But after she was gone, the house grew louder. The hum deepened, merging with the faint ringing in his ears, until it was impossible to tell which came from the machines and which came from him. That winter, he walked through the city in a fog so thick it seemed alive. Through the haze, he saw the glow of the posters, the angels shining brighter than ever, their smiles almost human. He wondered if they were mocking him, or perhaps they were not angels at all, but ghosts born from the hands of every man who had called sin by another name. He turned away, walking faster, but even as he fled, the light followed him, reflecting in every puddle, shimmering on every wall. London had found its angels, and they were made of electricity, but beneath their glowing halos, he saw the truth. Every one of them wore a human face, and every one looked like his. The snow came early that winter, muffling the streets and burying the clamor of the city in a hush that felt almost merciful. For weeks, London's restless heartbeat slowed beneath the white veil, and Dr. Harland found himself walking longer routes home, taking side streets simply to hear the crunch of snow beneath his boots. It was the only sound that did not hum. His house had grown emptier. The servants were gone, his colleagues had ceased their visits, and even his patients came less often now. The city had outgrown him. There were cheaper clinics in every district, staffed by younger men with steadier ambition and fewer ghosts. The empire of hysteria had learned to run without its architect. He told himself this should bring peace. It did not. Without the rhythm of appointments, the house seemed to breathe differently, slowly, unevenly, like a convalescent. The silence between the walls no longer felt like rest. It felt like waiting. He still received letters, not from patients, but from men who had turned his method into commerce. One wrote to thank him for pioneering the path that allowed the profession to prosper. Another invited him to invest in a factory manufacturing electrotherapeutic novelties for domestic use. The letters came printed on thick paper, their ink pressed deep, their tone both congratulatory and predatory. They all spoke the same language, profit masquerading as gratitude. Harland left them unopened on his desk. He had begun to fear the sound of paper tearing. Sometimes he thought of Mrs. Finch and her calm defiance, of Mrs. Hensley and her quiet insight, of all the women who had passed through his hands believing they were being healed. He tried to remember their faces, but memory betrayed him. They came now as fragments, hands clasping the edge of the couch, the glint of light on a tear, the faint scent of violet powder. The rest had dissolved into the same faceless hum that haunted him. One night, unable to sleep, he descended to the surgery. The room was cold, the lamps unlit, the machine covered with a dust sheet that shimmered faintly in the moonlight. He stood before it for a long time, feeling its shape through the cloth like a priest before an altar. The metal was cold under his palm, yet he could almost imagine it pulsing. He thought of all the years he had spent convincing himself it was medicine, how he had hidden behind words like balance, equilibrium, nervous relief, how he had written those terms again and again in ledgers until they seemed like absolution. But now, stripped of light and sound, the truth was bare. The machine had not cured disease. It had simply given voice to what the century refused to name. His hand trembled as he reached for the switch. For a moment, he wanted to hear it again, to remind himself of what he had built, to feel that ghostly vibration return. But he stopped. The hum no longer belonged to him. It belonged to the world he had helped create. He turned away, leaving the sheet untouched. The snow outside had thickened, muting even the sound of the city. For the first time in years, the house was completely silent. Yet the silence did not soothe him. It pressed against his chest like guilt made tangible. In that stillness, he understood the weight he carried was not the shame of scandal, nor the burden of invention. It was the knowledge that he had given the world a new kind of hunger, and it would never be full again. By the spring thaw of 1896, shame had changed its shape. It no longer came draped in scandal or whispered through closed doors. It moved quietly now, wearing the face of progress. The women who once slipped into Dr. Harland's practice in fear now arrived with their heads held higher, their gloved hands steady. They called the treatments by name. They requested appointments openly. Some even laughed as they described their symptoms, as if confessing to a joke the century wasn't yet ready to understand. And yet, beneath that laughter, something had shifted. It wasn't the women who felt shame anymore. It was him. He saw it in their eyes, the calm, the certainty, the absence of fear. They no longer trembled under his touch. The sickness was gone, yes, but so too was their dependence. They met his gaze now with something approaching equality, and he found himself shrinking from it. He had built a profession upon their helplessness. Now, standing before their composure, he felt exposed. They thanked him still politely, warmly, but the gratitude sounded different. One woman clasped his hand after a session and said, "You were right, doctor. There was never anything wrong with me." He smiled because he had to, but her words landed like a verdict. At the society, he heard murmurs of discomfort, not from scandal, but from fear. The success of his method had produced an unintended consequence. Women who refused to return to their former fragility. Husbands wrote in anger. Priests thundered from pulpits. "The hysteria cure," one sermon declared, "has undone the very modesty that defined womanhood." Harland sat in the pew that morning, hat in hand, listening. He did not flinch. He knew the priest was right, though not in the way the man intended. The cure had worked too well. It had awakened something larger than the body. When he returned home that evening, he found another letter waiting on his desk. The handwriting was cold, familiar, measured, elegant, certain. "Mrs. Hensley, you asked once whether the cure restores balance or awakens desire," it read. "I believe it does both. It teaches a woman that her body is her own, and in that knowledge there is peace. You gave us the instrument, doctor. You cannot be blamed for the music." He read the line again and again until the letters blurred. The music. Yes, that was what it had always been. The hum, the breath, the trembling rhythm that filled his rooms. He had mistaken it for medicine, when it was really revelation. Outside, the city had begun to change. Posters for therapeutic devices hung beside ads for gramophones and sewing machines, all humming, all spinning, all promising ease. The line between invention and intimacy had vanished. The age was no longer afraid of the sound, but Dr. Harland was. The shame that once belonged to his patients had found its way back to him, lodged deep in his bones. He walked through his silent house and felt the walls pulse faintly, as if remembering the echoes of 1,000 women breathing at once. He had cured hysteria, yes, but in doing so, he had exposed the deeper madness of his century, a world terrified of women who no longer apologized for wanting to feel alive. The dissection theatre at St. Bartholomew's had always filled Dr. Harland with a solemn kind of awe. Rows of students sat above the stone table, their faces ghostly in the pale morning light, notebooks open, pens poised. Once, long ago, he too had been among them, young, certain, reverent. Now he stood where his mentors once had, hands clasped behind his back, the smell of preservative thick in his throat. Before him lay the body of a woman, unnamed, unclaimed, dissected for education's sake. "Observe the complexity of the nervous system," he began, his voice measured, professional. "From these filaments arise the sensations of pleasure, pain, motion, and thought. The whole of human experience, reduced to cords no thicker than thread." The students leaned forward, some scribbled, others watched with a fascination bordering on hunger. Harland lifted a thin length of nerve tissue with his forceps, its pale glisten catching the light. "It is the physician's task," he continued, "to understand where the impulses begin and how to quiet them when they misfire." He paused. The phrase, "quiet them," echoed strangely. Once, it had been the motto of his career. But as he stood there, watching the lamplight dance on the dissected nerve, he felt the absurdity of it. These threads were not meant to be silenced, they were meant to live. After the lecture, a young student approached him. "Sir," the boy asked, "is it true you discovered a cure for female hysteria?" Harland hesitated. "I discovered nothing," he said. "I only listened to what was already speaking." The student frowned, puzzled, but nodded politely before hurrying away. Harland remained behind long after the others had gone, the cadaver sheet drawn over the body, the lamps dimmed. He stared at the outline beneath the linen, a shape at once anonymous and unbearably human, and thought of how many women had lain before him, breathing, trembling, alive. This one would never breathe again. Yet the body spoke still, in silence. He found himself returning to his old medical texts that night. Gray's Anatomy, the physiology of the female nerves, the principles of medical electricity. Their pages were yellowed, their margins crowded with his notes. He read them differently now. The certainty he once admired had curdled into arrogance. "The female is prone to emotional instability due to the superabundance of sensory tissue," one line read. He traced the words with his fingertip until the ink smudged. They had built entire sciences upon misunderstanding. They had mapped desire as disorder, catalogued longing as illness, and taught generations of men to wield authority where empathy should have lived. Harland closed the book and looked at his reflection in the darkened window. The lines around his eyes had deepened. The hum he thought he'd silenced still echoed faintly in his skull. He realized, with a bitter clarity, that he had spent his life dissecting not only the body, but the soul, separating sensation from meaning, until both were unrecognizable. In the end, anatomy had taught him nothing of life, only how fragile its currents were, how easily they could be severed, and how impossible it was to stitch them back once they were gone. The next case came not through a letter, but by the knock of a husband. He arrived one grey afternoon, wrapped in a wool coat, too fine for his manners, hat clutched nervously in his hands. Behind him stood his wife, young, pale, her eyes hidden beneath a heavy veil. The man bowed slightly, clearing his throat before speaking. "Dr. Harland," he said, "I've brought my wife. She's unwell. You understand." It was the tone of a man used to transactions, land, cattle, debt, not souls. Harlan gestured toward the consultation room. The woman obeyed the movement of her husband's hand, stepping inside like a shadow crossing a doorway. When the door closed, the man removed an envelope from his coat and placed it on the desk. The wax seal was still soft. "She's been melancholy," he said. "Listless, unresponsive. I've tried everything: music, travel, servants. The physician in Mayfair said you might restore her." "Restore?" Harlan repeated softly. "Yes. He said you specialize in nervous disorders of the female type. You'll find her docile enough. And of course, you have my full permission." The words struck him harder than he expected. My permission. They landed with the weight of law. He looked down at the envelope payment in advance, precise, cold, and felt a wave of nausea. When the man finally left, Harlan stood for a long moment before the closed door. The wife remained seated, hands folded neatly in her lap, veil still drawn. She looked less like a patient than an offering. "You may lift the veil," he said gently. She obeyed. Beneath the lace, her face was delicate, almost translucent. "You have been unwell?" Her eyes flicked toward the door her husband had gone through. "He says so," she murmured. "What do you say?" Her lips parted, but no sound came. The silence between them was immense. He realized then that she had not spoken for herself in years, perhaps ever. He began the examination with slow precision, careful to explain each step. She did not flinch, did not tremble, did not resist. It was as though she had long ago surrendered the ownership of her own flesh. The machine hummed faintly in the background, but he did not switch it on. He could not. When it was over, he handed her a cup of water and said softly, "You may tell him you were treated." Her eyes lifted to his, searching. "You will not?" "No," he said. "Not today." For the first time, she smiled. It was small and weary, but it reached her eyes. She placed a hand on the table, fingers tracing the outline of the machine's brass casing. "He wants me cured," she said quietly. "But what he calls illness is simply the part of me he cannot control." He said nothing. She stood, replaced her veil, and walked to the door with the poise of a woman who had just remembered herself. After she was gone, Harlan sat at his desk, staring at the unopened envelope. He thought of the phrase that had defined his career, the husband's consent, how it had been written into every form, every treatment note, every bill. That evening, he tore the envelope in two without opening it. The coins fell across the floor, rolling into the corners of the room. For the first time, he did not stoop to gather them. He let them lie there, gleaming faintly in the gaslight, small cold relics of a permission he would never again ask for. It began in the parlors of Mayfair, beneath the chandeliers and the scent of rosewater, where conversation was both performance and war. Women gathered in circles of lace and pearls, their fans fluttering like wings, concealing expressions far sharper than they appeared. They had learned over endless afternoons that laughter could hide anything: boredom, defiance, even revelation. It was there, amid the soft clinking of teacups, that Harlan's method became entertainment. At first, the stories were whispered, humorous, harmless, dressed in euphemism. "My nerves were in revolt again," one lady might say, tapping her fan against her chin, but Dr. Harlan soothed them perfectly. "I feel practically reborn." The others would laugh, not cruelly, but knowingly. The laughter was their shield. It allowed them to say everything without saying anything. Soon, the talk became bolder. The wives of Parliament, members, bishops, and barristers traded tales with sparkling wit. "Heaven knows," one said over her glass of sherry, "the good doctor has done more for marriage than all the clergymen in London combined." A burst of laughter followed, sharp, musical, dangerous. What began as jest became ritual. The women who visited him began to recognize one another in carriages, at dinner tables, at charity events. Their eyes met, and the faintest flicker of understanding passed between them, an acknowledgement of a secret they now shared. It was not scandal, it was solidarity. Harland noticed it in their mannerisms. They arrived no longer timid, but conspiratorial. They greeted him not as patients, but as equals in a quiet rebellion. A few even teased him gently, hiding boldness behind charm. "Doctor," one said, as he adjusted the machine, "I dare say London owes you its most peaceful husbands." Another smirked behind her gloved hand, adding, "And its happiest wives." He should have felt triumphant. Instead, he felt haunted. The laughter that echoed through those drawing rooms had begun to reach him in his sleep, soft, overlapping, growing, until it became indistinguishable from the hum of his machines. He could not tell whether the sound mocked him or absolved him. One evening, he was invited to a dinner at a patron's home, a lavish affair filled with polished silver and flattery. He had intended to decline, but curiosity won. Halfway through the meal, one of the ladies, an elegant woman with eyes like cut glass, leaned toward him. "You're quite the legend among us," she said, her voice low enough that only he could hear. He managed a polite smile. "I'm certain exaggeration plays its part." She shook her head slowly. "Not exaggeration, transformation." Her fan opened with a soft snap. "You see, Doctor, you didn't just cure us. You reminded us what power feels like." He had no reply. That night, walking home through the fog, her words echoed inside him. Power. That was what it had always been about, though he had never dared name it. The city could dress it in the silk of medicine or hide it behind laughter, but it remained the same. Power stolen, power shared, power returned. From that evening onward, the laughter that once drifted through London's salons no longer sounded like amusement. It sounded like revolution. Learning how to whisper, by the late months of 1896, the machines had escaped. Not in the literal sense. They had no legs, no minds, but they no longer belonged to the doctors. They had slipped quietly from surgeries and hospitals into private homes, tucked behind curtains, stored in polished wardrobes, hidden beneath lace covers. London's women had brought them home. It began innocently, or so it appeared. Manufacturers had advertised household versions for therapeutic self-application, smaller, quieter, more refined. The devices were packaged in velvet boxes with silver clasps, accompanied by instruction booklets written in language so polite that even the most devout husband could not object, to calm the nerves and restore the vitality of the feminine spirit. That phrase appeared everywhere, from fashion catalogues to women's journals, accompanied by illustrations of delicate hands, adjusting dials, serene faces bathed in candlelight. The first time Harland saw one outside his practice, he felt the air leave his chest. He had been invited to a patient's home, a Lady Bexley, who had written of an irregularity following his treatments. Her townhouse was immaculate, the smell of beeswax and lilies heavy in the hall. When she led him to her dressing room, there, between the perfume bottles and the mirror, stood the machine, his machine, its brass gleaming like an idol. "I purchased it directly from Manchester," she said proudly. "The company claimed it was built to your exact specifications. I hope you don't mind." Harland stared at it. The design was unmistakable. The curvature of the handle, the polished casing, even the small indentation he'd once added to steady his grip. Except this one was trimmed in gold, its cord coiled neatly like a sleeping snake. "It suits your decor," he murmured, unable to think of anything else. "Oh, indeed," she said with a smile. "It's remarkable, Doctor. I've no need to visit your surgery now. My maid assists me when necessary, though sometimes," her voice lowered, a hint of mischief in her tone, "I prefer to manage it myself." Her words struck him like a confession uttered in church. She wasn't ashamed. There was no tremor in her voice, no hint of the old fragility that once filled his rooms. She was radiant, unburdened. She thanked him as one might thank a man for inventing light. That night, Harland returned home through a city transformed. He noticed now that every street seemed to hum faintly, every house lit too brightly, as if something alive stirred behind its walls. Over the following weeks, he learned that Lady Bexley was not unique. Letters from patients mentioned personal devices, private restorers, machines for solitude. Some had been gifts from husbands, others secret indulgences bought in cash. What once required permission had become routine. The sound of his hum had spread everywhere. Behind curtains, through floorboards, inside wardrobes. One evening, standing in his empty surgery, Harland caught the faintest vibration in the walls. Not from his own machines, they were unplugged, but from somewhere beyond, drifting through the bricks like memory. The city was singing, softly, privately, endlessly. For years he had carried the guilt of creation. Now, as he stood in the quiet house that had once been his kingdom, he realized that guilt no longer belonged to him either. The women had taken the cure, the pleasure, and the shame, and hidden them together, humming in the dark behind polished wardrobe doors. The city had found its heartbeat again, and for the first time, it did not need a doctor to keep it alive. By the summer of 1897, the portable cure had become the latest triumph of British ingenuity. Its arrival was heralded with the same reverence once reserved for the telegraph or the steam engine. The advertisements called it the modern lady's companion, a delicate, clock-sized device that could be carried discreetly in a handbag or kept on a bedside table without shame. It was electricity reduced to elegance, science refined into secrecy. The men who manufactured it spoke not of medicine, but of innovation. A marvel of convenience, they said, designed for the comfort of the fairer sex. The public demonstrations were carefully staged. Polite applause followed each display of humming precision, though the audience, mostly men, never acknowledged what they were truly seeing. A female assistant would touch the machine to her wrist, smiling faintly as it vibrated, and the crowd would murmur their approval. No one laughed, no one dared. Dr. Harland attended one such exhibition at the Royal Polytechnic Institute. He sat in the back row, half hidden beneath the brim of his hat, watching as the inventor, a young man with bright eyes and an unnerving confidence, spoke about the domestication of energy. "Our homes are becoming alive," the man declared. "Every lamp, every kettle, every instrument of modern life now hums with vitality. Why should the body be left behind?" Applause thundered through the hall. Harland did not join in. The words were too close to prophecy. Afterward, he approached the demonstration table. The new model was smaller than his own creation, encased in smooth nickel with an adjustable switch. When he touched it, the vibration was steady, soothing, almost gentle. He imagined how it must feel in the hands of those who used it, no longer as patients but as owners. A century ago, women had been forbidden to read without permission. Now, they held in their palms the power to alter their own bodies. He left the building before the lecture ended. Outside, the air smelled of ozone and rain. London's sky was dark with soot and promise. He walked along Regent Street, past the glowing shop windows filled with clocks, cameras, and tiny electrical motors. The city pulsed like a living organism, each light, each wire, each heartbeat connected. In one window, he caught sight of a display that stopped him cold. Half a dozen of the new portable restorers lined up like silver relics, their surfaces gleaming beneath the lamplight. Above them hung a placard in delicate script, a gift for every wife who values her well-being. He stared at it until the reflection of his own face blurred in the glass. He saw not a doctor, but a relic himself, an artifact of an age already being erased by its inventions. That night, he sat at his desk, staring at the original blueprints that had once filled him with pride. The lines looked almost childish now, crude sketches of control drawn by a man who mistook authority for knowledge. He folded them neatly, placed them in the fireplace, and struck a match. The paper curled, flared, and turned to ash. The flames illuminated the empty room for a moment, brief, bright, then gone. He waited for relief, but none came. Outside, the hum of the city continued, rising and falling like breath. The world no longer needed his steady hand, nor his permission. The cure had been unbound, miniaturized, and sold, and somewhere in the streets below, a woman was holding one in her hands, smiling faintly. unaware that she was carrying the end of an era. By the autumn of 1897, the cure had become competition. What once thrived in secrecy was now an open field of profit and pride. The newspapers called it the patent wars. Though no blood was spilled, only reputations, fortunes, and the last illusions of medical virtue. Harland read about it first in the Times. A small article buried beneath reports of Parliament debates announced that two manufacturers, Dunscombe Electrical and the Continental Therapeutic Company, had filed rival patents for mechanical apparatuses for the relief of feminine, nervous excitation. The words were clinical, almost laughably so, but everyone knew what they meant. Within weeks, more names joined the fray. Harrow's harmonizer, the Temple restorative engine, the Imperial nervine regulator. Even French and American firms began shipping their own models across the Channel, boasting improvements in amplitude and endurance. It became a race not for healing, but for ownership. Lawyers filled the corridors of London's patent office. Engineers argued over voltage and frequency. The very language of desire was being dismantled and rebuilt in terms of mechanism. Every court case spoke of motors, rotors, and oscillations per second. Never once did a judge mention what these inventions actually did to the human body. Progress demanded euphemism. Harland attended one of the hearings out of morbid curiosity. The courtroom smelled of ink and sweat, its benches crowded with businessmen pretending to be scholars. Two attorneys debated the angle of a brass piston, as if discussing scripture. "My client's design ensures continuous rotation," one declared, "while the defendant's mechanism operates by pulsation, an entirely distinct phenomenon." Laughter rippled through the gallery low, knowing, dangerous. The judge rapped his gavel once, though his mouth twitched with amusement. Harland left before the verdict. Outside, the fog hung low over the city, curling around the street lamps like smoke from an unseen fire. He walked aimlessly through the cold, the sound of machinery echoing faintly from workshops and factories. Every hum, every pulse, every hiss of steam reminded him that he had lost something intangible, something far greater than invention. A week later, a letter arrived from one of the manufacturers. "Dr. Parland," it began, "your early work has been cited in several patent disputes. We would be honored to offer you a position as consultant. Your name lends legitimacy to our enterprise." He burned it without reading further. But the letters kept coming, some offering money, others flattery, one even promising immortality. "Your name, sir, engraved upon every model distributed across the empire." He imagined it, his signature carved into brass, shipped to every colony, vibrating through the hands of women he would never meet. The thought sickened him. By Christmas, the advertisements had grown bolder. They now promised scientific satisfaction, rapid recovery, and domestic discretion. Posters lined the railway stations, the faces of women drawn with parted lips and closed eyes. Above them, in bright letters, the slogans shouted, "Progress you can feel." Harland stopped reading newspapers. He spent his days wandering the streets, watching the new century assemble itself from wire and greed. The machine had been perfected, patented, and sold. It no longer belonged to doctors, nor even to women, it belonged to commerce. The cure had become currency, the hum had become industry, and somewhere in the machinery of progress, humanity itself had been filed away, unclaimed, unpatented, and forgotten. The first sermon arrived before the first arrest. It was preached on a Sunday morning in St. George's, Bloomsbury, to a congregation of respectable wives and worried men. The clergyman, a tall, angular man with eyes like frost, spoke with the solemn fervor of one who believed himself rescuing a fallen world. His voice carried through the nave, rising above the pews, striking every marble surface. "There are forces," he declared, "that cloak corruption in the guise of science, devices that promise purity but deliver perdition, temptations, my brethren, that vibrate not from heaven but from the very pit." A few gasps fluttered through the crowd. He had not spoken the word, but they all knew it. The electric cure, the whisper of the decade. By evening, Newspapers carried excerpts from the sermon, the shocking vice of the drawing room, one headline proclaimed. Others followed. Science or sin, electric temptresses threaten the home. The city that had once celebrated progress now began to shrink from it, suddenly remembering its morality. Harland read them all, though each word felt like a mirror turned toward him. The tone was familiar, a language of outrage polished by hypocrisy. The same men who had built the industry now denounced it. Politicians demanded inquiries. Clergymen called for bans. Husbands turned suspicious eyes toward their wives, accusing them of indecency for the very treatments they once approved. And yet, behind closed doors, the machines continued to hum. The panic did not silence them, it only made them secret again. Women wrote to him anonymously now. Their letters no longer spoke of gratitude or awakening, they spoke of fear. "He took it from me," one confessed. "He said it was unholy." Another, "They call us corrupted, but I only feel alive." The handwriting varied, but the message never changed. Shame, once dissolved, had returned, colder and sharper than before. Harland began to feel it too. Strangers recognized him on the street, not with admiration now, but suspicion. A pamphlet even mentioned his name, among those who had profited from the moral decline of English womanhood. His door was defaced one morning with chalk, "Purveyor of sin." He stood before it in the fog, reading the words until the rain blurred them into illegible streaks. Then he went inside, closed the door, and locked it. Inside the house, the silence felt heavier than ever. The machines were gone. He had dismantled the last of them months ago. Yet the memory of their hum remained. He could almost hear it faint, rhythmic, pulsing beneath the noise of the storm outside. He realized, with sudden clarity, that the sound was not gone. It had moved into the city, the country, the century itself. The panic burned bright for a season, then dimmed. Moral crusades always did. But something had changed irrevocably. The cure had become taboo, and the women who had found their voices now whispered once more. The empire of desire had gone underground. Harland understood then that progress was not a ladder but a circle, one that turned endlessly, from repression to revelation and back again. He had watched it spin his entire life, and as he sat by the window, listening to the faint echoes of London's unrest, he wondered which would come first, forgiveness or forgetting. It was bound to happen. A secret that large, carried by so many hearts, could not remain silent forever. It began, fittingly, in the lecture hall of the Royal Medical Society, the same place where, years ago, men had first spoken of hysteria, as though it were an exotic creature to be studied and tamed. But on this day, the speaker was not a man. Her name was Eleanor Murchison, a former patient of Harland's who had once come to him pale and trembling, sent by a husband who could no longer bear her silence. She had left his surgery months later, with her eyes bright and her voice steady. Now she stood at the lectern in a grey dress, her hands unshaking, her gaze direct. "I am told," she began, "that women like me are subjects of study. We are called disordered, hysterical, excessive. I have come to tell you that the only sickness I ever suffered was obedience." The words landed like stones in a pond. Ripples of discomfort moved through the rows of starched collars and black coats. One of the physicians cleared his throat. Another scoffed softly. Eleanor continued, her voice measured but fierce. "For years, men have written of our nerves, our fragility, our supposed dependence upon your guidance. You have invented machines to quiet us, drugs to dull us, institutions to hide us, but you never once asked us what we felt." A murmur spread through the hall, shocked laughter, the rustle of papers, a low hiss of dissent. Still she pressed on. "You did not cure us. You reminded us that our bodies are ours, that pleasure is not sin, that silence is not virtue, and that knowledge, gentlemen, you cannot unteach." Harland sat at the back, motionless. He had not expected to see her there. When she spoke, he felt something inside him break open, not shame, exactly, but recognition. The air around him seemed charged again, like the moment before a storm. One of the older doctors rose to interrupt her. "Madam, you speak dangerously. You risk undoing the very order that keeps society intact." Eleanor smiled faintly. "Then perhaps it deserves undoing." The hall erupted, half in outrage, half in awe. The chairman pounded his gavel for silence, declaring the meeting adjourned, but the damage was done. The next morning, every paper in London carried her name. Woman declares war on medical authority. Former patient denounces hysteria cure as moral fraud. The scandal spread faster than any sermon. Letters poured in, some condemning her, others thanking her. Anonymous women signed their initials at the bottom of brief, trembling notes. "You spoke for me. I thought I was the only one. You've named what we could not." Dr. Harland received no letters that week, only silence. But in that silence, he heard something new, something not mechanical, not medicinal, but alive. The hum he had spent his life mastering was gone. In its place came a different sound, faint but growing. The rhythm of women's voices, gathering in parlors, in libraries, in the streets. Eleanor Murchison had spoken aloud, and the echo of her words would not fade. The cure had escaped not only its machines but its meaning. What had begun as medicine had become movement, and though he knew he had no place in it, Harland could not help but feel the smallest flicker of relief. At last, someone else was holding the instrument. And this time, the music belonged entirely to them. The backlash came swiftly, as it always did when truth left a woman's mouth. Within weeks of Eleanor Murchison's speech, the Royal Society for Moral Reform had petitioned Parliament for the restoration of decency in medical practice. It was not Eleanor they named directly, but every woman like her and every doctor who had ever laid a hand, mechanical or otherwise, on what they now called the sanctity of the female body. The hearings were held in a tall, echoing chamber that smelled of dust, pipe smoke, and fear. Clergymen sat beside barristers, matrons whispered from the gallery. The men who had once sold the cure as progress now arrived in dark coats, sweating, their faces pale beneath their respectability. They spoke in measured tones of misunderstanding, of misapplication, of science gone astray. Each sought to save his name by surrendering his conviction. Dr. Harland did not intend to attend. For weeks he had avoided the city, walking its outer edges, listening to the quiet hum of trams and telegraphs, the ghosts of his invention still whispering beneath the streets. But the morning of the hearing, he found himself drawn there nonetheless. Curiosity, or perhaps guilt, carried him through the door. The chamber was full. Reporters scribbled. The chairman, a severe man with a voice like a gavel, called the first witness, Eleanor herself. She walked forward calmly, dressed in plain grey wool, the same composure she had shown in the lecture hall. A murmur spread as she took her place. "Mrs. Murchison," the chairman began, "you stand accused not of crime, but of impropriety, of endangering the moral fabric of our society through reckless speech. You have described the practices of reputable physicians as, what was your word? Violation. Do you stand by that term?" "I do," she said, "because that is what it was." Gasps broke out. Someone coughed loudly to mask it. The chairman adjusted his spectacles. "You imply intent, madam, to accuse men of dishonor." "I accuse men of blindness," she replied, her tone steady. "They built machines to quiet women, not realizing they were amplifying us instead." Her words rippled through the chamber. Harland felt his pulse in his throat. He had not expected her to look at him, but she did, just once. Not with malice, but with recognition. It was enough. When she finished, the men took turns denouncing her, some polite, others venomous, a danger to public virtue, an affront to science, a woman unfit to speak. The phrases fell like stones, but Eleanor did not flinch. She stood silent, eyes forward, until the last accusation had been flung. Then she said quietly, "You call it indecent, because it reminds you that women are not inventions, we are not your discoveries." The chamber erupted, shouts, protests, the pounding of the gavel. Harland rose and left before it ended. Outside, the air was cold, bright, almost painful. He walked aimlessly through the square as the bells began to ring from nearby churches, tolling, scolding, endless. He thought of how those same bells had once marked the hours of his treatments, the rhythm of his days. Now they sounded like warning, like judgment, like history turning its gaze. Inside the Parliament building, the trial of decency would continue for months. But Harland knew it no longer mattered. The age of silence had already been pronounced guilty, and in its place, something braver, something terrifyingly alive was being born. By the dawn of 1898, London no longer slept in darkness. Every night the city glowed, its avenues washed in the cold white light of electricity. The gas lamps that once hissed and flickered were being torn out, replaced by humming filaments caged in glass. The streets had changed their color. So had the century. Harland watched the transformation from the window of his study. Across the Thames, the new power station loomed like a temple, its smokestacks releasing plumes of grey into the pale sky. He could hear the faint crackle of current carried along the wires, an invisible river that ran above the city's roofs, connecting homes, shops, hospitals. Electricity had become the bloodstream of the modern world. It lit the lamps, drove the trains, animated the machines, and, though no one said it aloud, it had become the pulse of desire itself. He had once believed he understood power. He had measured it in voltage, in heartbeats, in the tremor of flesh under the palm. But this was something else. This was dominion disguised as illumination. The same energy that had hummed in his instruments now ruled the empire. Newspaper headlines celebrated it daily. The bright century. Electricity, the servant of civilization. Yet beneath those triumphal words, he saw something more intimate, more disturbing. The advertisements that once sold his machines now sold everything else in their likeness. Electric brushes, electric corsets, electric belts promising vigor and vitality. Even the household itself was being mechanized. The domestic sphere, once silent and slow, now vibrated with invisible current. The women of London had changed too. He saw them in the streets, walking briskly with books and briefcases, talking freely in cafes that would once have turned them away. Some were students of medicine, others journalists, campaigners, or teachers. They wore dark dresses, high collars, and expressions that did not lower when men passed. He recognized in their stride the same quiet confidence that had filled his surgery years before. The current had passed through them too. He heard that Eleanor Murchison had joined a society for women's education and was giving lectures on the history of medical control. The newspapers mocked her, calling her the prophetess of nerves, but her audiences grew. He sometimes imagined her voice echoing through halls, awakening minds the way the machines had once awakened bodies. He never went to see her speak. He didn't need to. The age she had helped ignite was everywhere. One evening, walking home through the illuminated fog, he stopped at a shop window. A row of lamps glowed within, each one labeled Harland Model Guaranteed Safe Current. He stood there, stunned. The design was not his, yet his name had survived, stripped of meaning and sold as a commodity. His legacy had been electrified, cleansed of shame, made palatable for polite society. He turned away, heart pounding, and looked out over the city, the cables strung like veins between the glowing towers, the hum rising from every street like prayer. London was alive now, quickened by the very force he had once tried to master. He thought of the women who had passed through his hands, of their breath, their trembling, their awakening. He realized they had always been the truest reflection of electricity, dangerous, untamable, radiant. The age belonged to them now, not to the men who wired it into being. And as he walked on beneath the new electric lamps, his shadow followed him faithfully across the bright pavement, small, dark, and finely honest, keeping pace in the light of the world he had helped set ablaze. By the spring of 1899, the name of Dr. Edward Harland had begun to fade from public life. It did not happen in scandal or violence, as many expected, but in silence, a slow erasure, deliberate and efficient. His peers stopped citing his papers. The journals that once praised his advancement of feminine medicine now omitted him entirely, his discoveries absorbed under other names. When people spoke of the early pioneers of electrotherapeutics, they mentioned Dunscombe, Barrow, and Ferris, never Harland. It was as though he had never existed. He closed his practice quietly that March. No announcement, no farewell to his patients. The last of his machines was dismantled and sold for scrap. The servants dismissed, the house shuttered. He paid the maid Ruth double her wages and thanked her for her silence. Then, one fog-heavy morning, he locked the front door for the final time and walked away. He left London without destination. The city had grown too loud, too bright. Every street seemed to hum with the same faint vibration, as if mocking him. The electric lamps that now lined every avenue cast a light so white it made the world look bleached, unreal. He took the train north, sitting among tradesmen and travellers, his luggage nothing but a doctor's bag and a few notebooks. He disembarked in a small coastal town in Yorkshire, the kind of place where winter never fully left the air. The sea there was grey, restless, endless. He rented a modest cottage at the edge of the cliffs and told the landlord he was a retired physician seeking solitude. The man did not ask questions. The English respect a quiet withdrawal. The days passed in steady rhythm, morning walks along the shore, afternoons spent reading, evenings by lamplight. But even here, the hum found him. The cottage's single electric bulb buzzed faintly whenever he switched it on, a small, constant reminder of the empire that now pulsed through every wire in Britain. Some nights, he kept it off, choosing instead the flicker of a candle. He found comfort in the way its flame bent and swayed, fragile and alive, untethered to any current. Occasionally, letters arrived, a few from former patients, addressed uncertainly, as if unsure he still lived. One from Eleanor Murchison, written in a firm, elegant hand. You must know that what you began has outgrown you. Women write to me from every city, speaking of freedom, of self, of choice. They name your machines not as instruments of medicine, but of memory. You may wish to vanish, but your work has entered the bloodstream of the world. He did not reply. He folded the letter carefully and placed it inside his old medical bag. One evening, as dusk melted into fog, a fisherman passing by saw a solitary figure standing at the cliff's edge. The man said later that the doctor looked peaceful, his hands clasped behind his back, his coat billowing in the wind. When the fisherman returned the next morning, the spot was empty. The footprints led only to the brink, ending where the land gave way to sea. Weeks later, the cottage was cleared. Inside, they found nothing but empty notebooks, a broken lamp, and one peculiar object beneath the bed. A small, hand-sized machine, silent, corroded by salt. The local constable called it junk and tossed it away. And so Dr. Edward Harland disappeared. No obituary, no inquiry, no legacy left in print. Yet every time a faint hum drifted through a wire, or a woman felt the pulse of the century beneath her skin, he was there still, invisible, forgotten, but never entirely gone. Her name was Clara Bellamy, though the newspapers preferred Miss C, a certain lady of the stage. She had been famous once, or as famous as a woman could be in the last years of Queen Victoria's reign. Her posters had hung outside the Lyceum, her face illuminated by the new electric lamps that made the city's nights glitter like day. But in the spring of 1900, her name reappeared not in the theatre columns, but in the legal notices of the Times. Actress committed to Hanwell Asylum for nervous excitation. The article was brief, 30 lines at most, but its cruelty was efficient. She had spoken publicly, it said, about the use of certain electrical instruments for the benefit of the feminine nerves, claiming them to be a source of divine revelation rather than medicine. That was enough. Within days, her husband, also her manager, signed the papers that delivered her to confinement. The physicians declared her unfit for society. Hanwell stood on the city's western edge, a fortress of red brick and iron gates, the kind of place that called itself a hospital but smelled like a prison. Its halls were long and windowed, its wards arranged with military precision. The women inside were labeled not by name, but by condition: melancholia, mania, hysteria. The doctors who tended them were practical men, devoted to order. Miss Bellamy arrived on a rain-soaked afternoon. She carried no luggage, only a silver locket and a book of poems. Her hair had been shorn short for sanitation. When asked her name, she replied, "Electricity." Her file noted this as delusional speech. In her first interview, she told the superintendent that her so-called illness began not in madness but in clarity. She had seen something in those humming machines that no one else dared name. "They say they built them to calm us," she said, "but they are alive. They speak." "Speak?" the superintendent asked dryly. "Not in words, in pulses. They are the first things to answer when a woman cries." He closed the folder and recommended seclusion. From her cell window, Clara could see the asylum's generator shed a low building, crowned with a wire antenna. At night, when the rest of the wards were silent, the shed glowed faintly blue, its windows flickering with electrical light. She would rise from her cot and press her hand to the glass, whispering, "I can hear you." The attendant said she was praying. Weeks passed. Her husband stopped visiting. The newspapers lost interest. But among the patients, her name lingered. They called her the Bright Lady because she claimed to dream in light. Then, one stormy night, the power failed. When the attendants relit the lamps, Clara was gone. Her door was locked from the inside, her bed cold. The next morning, the nurses found her locket hanging from the generator fence. Inside was no portrait, only a scrap of paper that read, "Tell them we were awake." The report filed the event as suicide. The case was closed. But in the years that followed, strange tales circulated through Hanwell's corridors. Patients swore that, during electrical storms, the lights in the women's ward flickered in perfect rhythm. 3 pulses, then silence, then 3 again. Some said it sounded like a heartbeat. Others said it was applause. And though her body was never found, her name began appearing again not in the playbills, but in whispers. Clara Bellamy, the actress who escaped through light, for a brief, impossible moment, even the doctors wondered if she had. The fire began in the archives of the Royal Medical Society one windless night in February of 1901. It started, the watchman claimed, with a gas lamp overturned in the records room, though no one ever confirmed how it truly began. By morning, more than 30 years of medical correspondence, research, and case files had gone up in smoke among them. The entire section labeled hysteria, 1,871,899. The city papers reported it as an unfortunate accident. The Times blamed poor ventilation. The Gazette praised the swift efforts of the fire brigade. But in the days that followed, rumours flickered through London like embers, rumours of deliberate erasure. Someone, it was said, had seen a man moving through the corridors long after closing, a lantern in his hand, a bundle of papers tucked beneath his coat. Dr. Harlan's name was mentioned once, quietly, then dropped. By then, he had already vanished. When the smoke cleared, the Society's surviving members set about restoring order. They announced a plan to rebuild the archives, but only with relevant, reputable material. The topic of hysteria, they decided, was no longer fashionable. Electricity had moved on to light, to locomotion, to industry. The age of nerves had been replaced by the age of machinery. The women, it seemed, were to be forgotten along with the files. In the weeks after the fire, small piles of singed paper began appearing at the city's second-hand stalls, scraps rescued from the flames, journal pages charred at the edges, diagrams of medical instruments, fragments of patient records. One scrap, brittle as ash, bore only a sentence. The patient reports a great calm after the paroxysm followed by laughter. Another read, "The hum soothes the body but disturbs the conscience." Collectors bought them out of curiosity. Scholars purchased them to cite in essays on Victorian pathology. But the women who read them, maids, typists, governesses recognized something else. These were not relics of science. They were evidence of a crime both hidden and holy. The burned notes passed between hands like relics from a forbidden church. One evening, in a narrow bookshop near Covent Garden, a clerk discovered a small notebook that had somehow survived the fire, almost intact. The spine was cracked, the pages yellowed, but the handwriting was unmistakable, fine, steady, precise. At the top of the first page, E. Harland, Private Observations. The clerk sold it the next morning to a man in a dark coat, who paid in gold and asked no questions. The notebook was never seen again. But fragments of its contents surfaced over the years, lines reprinted in obscure journals, quoted anonymously in pamphlets about women's rights. One sentence became almost legendary: "If the world burns our notes, the body will write its own." When Eleanor Murchison read that line aloud at a meeting of the Women's Medical League later that spring, a hush filled the room. Some swore they could still smell smoke in the air. Whether Harland set the fire himself, no one ever proved. Perhaps it was mercy, or madness, or an attempt to bury what could no longer be atoned for. But the destruction did not silence the story. The burned notes became gospel, and though the official record erased the history of female hysteria, its ashes spread wider than paper ever could, carried in whispers, in hands, in the living hum that refused to die. By 1902, London had learned how to bury its sins in velvet and call them innovation. The same brass instruments once hidden behind locked doors now gleamed in the open displays of Oxford Street. For the modern woman, the advertisements proclaimed, their letters curling like ribbons across the page. Electric health at your fingertips, restorative, refined, respectable. The word pleasure never appeared, but its ghost haunted every syllable. In shop windows the devices stood upon mirrored pedestals beside combs, corsets, and perfumes. They were smaller, now streamlined, elegant, fitted with mother-of-pearl handles and batteries disguised as jewelry cases. The age of treatment had become the age of self-care. Every home a haven of health, promised the Dunscombe Electric Company, unveiling its latest model, the Serenity engine, at the Crystal Palace exhibition. The crowd applauded politely. No one dared to laugh. Harland read of it from afar. By then he lived in a small room above a chemist's shop in Whitby, where the sea air was sharp enough to strip the past from one's lungs. He rarely left his window seat, though the papers reached him every week. He studied the advertisements, tracing the evolution of deceit. Therapeutic became invigorating, nervous restoration became personal rejuvenation. Progress was simply the art of renaming desire until it sounded pure. The world that had condemned him now praised the empire his silence had built. Doctors lectured about electrotonic vitality. Engineers spoke of domestic emancipation through invention. A well-known lecturer even invoked his forgotten field as evidence of British modernity. Our women, he declared, are healthier, more industrious, more serene than ever before. We owe this to the harmony between science and home. Harland could almost hear the applause. He folded the newspaper and set it aside. The wind outside rattled the panes, carrying the panes. Low, distant thrum of the town's new electric plant. The sound was familiar, uncomfortably so, a vibration that seemed to reach into the ribs. The hum that had once defined his life was now the heartbeat of the world. He poured himself tea with unsteady hands. On the table lay a single artifact from his old practice, a brass switch plate engraved with his initials. It had been salvaged from the ruins of his laboratory, polished by time until the letters had nearly vanished. Sometimes he turned it over in his palms like a coin, wondering which side of it had ever been virtue. He had once believed invention could redeem desire by disguising it, but now he saw that the disguise had only made it thrive. Society had accepted pleasure not by confessing it, but by industrializing it, selling it under glass, electrified and perfumed, humming discreetly in the bedrooms of the polite. That evening, as twilight bled into the sea, Harland lit a single candle and stared at its flame. It flickered, uneven, alive in a way electricity never could be. For all its brilliance, electricity could not waver, it did not breathe. He thought of Eleanor Murchison, of Clara Bellamy, of the countless unnamed women who had carried the tremor of that first hum into the century beyond him. The world had rebranded what he began, wrapped it in civility, made it eternal. Progress had inherited pleasure's skin. Somewhere beyond his window, the wires sang their endless tune. He closed his eyes and listened. The hum no longer accused him. It had become history indifferent, unrepentant, unstoppable. By the winter of 1903, London was quieter, or so it seemed. The moral panic had cooled, the advertisements had softened, and the great noise of invention had settled into domestic rhythm. The factories still thundered, the trams still hissed, the wires still sang overhead, but in the parlours and bedrooms of England, silence reigned once more. A polite, rehearsed, genteel silence. It was not the silence of repression, it was something subtler, more dangerous. It was the silence of women who knew and would not say. They had learned how to conceal the hum. The new machines were small enough to fit in dressing drawers, light enough to hide beneath lace and linen. The manuals instructed them not to speak of their use to anyone outside the household, so they didn't. But every home had its faint current, every wife her secret ritual. To visitors, the women of the new century looked composed, serene, modern. They wore clean lines instead of ruffles, spoke of literature instead of faith, and smiled without trembling. The world called them improved, but when the lamps dimmed at night, when the servants retired, the silence turned charged. There was the faint whir behind the closed door, the drawn breath, the stillness after, and in that moment, every woman became her own physician. The cure no longer needed men, papers, or permission. It had evolved into quiet autonomy. Dr. Harland read about them sometimes, women's magazines filled with advice on hygiene and vitality. He saw the same phrases he had written decades ago, stripped of meaning and guilt. He knew their tone intimately, the mixture of comfort and deceit that sold submission as wellness. But in that silence between their words, he imagined something different, a revolution too private to announce. He often wondered if the husbands heard. Did they notice the faint hum through the walls, the glow beneath the bedroom door? Did they choose not to ask? Or had they grown accustomed to a peace they did not understand? It was easier, after all, to mistake contentment for love. One evening, Harland met an old acquaintance at a seaside inn, a retired solicitor named Havisham, whose wife, he recalled, had once been one of his patients. Over brandy, the man spoke fondly of her improvement. "She's a new woman, Harland," Havisham said. "Always calm now, never weeps, never argues. A blessing, truly." "Does she seem happy?" Harland asked. The man blinked, as if the question were foreign. "Happy? She's steady. Isn't that what happiness means?" Harland smiled faintly but said nothing. When they parted, he stood by the window and watched the tide drag light from the horizon. The sea made its soft electric hiss, the same note that had followed him across the years. The silence of the wives spread far beyond London. It crossed borders, oceans, centuries. It whispered through homes wired for light and sound, through every hum mistaken for harmony. They had been told to be quiet, and they were. But in their silence lived something vast, electric, and undefeated. It moved unseen, from hand to hand, generation to generation, a language of pulse and breath. The world called it calm. They knew it was power. By 1905, the old city had already begun to excavate itself. London was a place layered with centuries of dust, soot, and memory, its foundations as thick with secrets as its streets were with fog. The new generation of scientists called it progress through preservation. They dug, catalogued, and displayed everything: bones, manuscripts, relics of faith and empire. But as they sifted through the dirt, they uncovered something far less comfortable: the remains of their own hypocrisies. At the British Museum, where the new galleries glowed beneath electric lamps, a small exhibition opened that spring. the instruments of early medical electricity. It drew polite crowds at first, students, doctors, and the curious. On the tables behind the glass lay the artifacts of a forgotten science: brass cylinders, rubber tubing, ivory handles, and coils of wire blackened with age. Their labels spoke with clinical precision: vibratory stimulator, circa 1880, pelvic massage apparatus, manufacturer unknown, portable nerve engine, recovered from private collection. Dr. Edward Harland's name appeared nowhere, yet his handwriting was unmistakable on one of the small tags, a looping, careful script that read simply, "For hysteria." The curators presented the objects as quaint, almost comic. They spoke of misguided but well-intentioned physicians, of Victorian eccentricity. The crowd tittered when the guide demonstrated a small hand-crank device that buzzed faintly in his palm. "Primitive, of course," he said, "but fascinating. Proof that medicine has evolved beyond such absurdities." The audience laughed, as though shame could be exorcised through ridicule. But a few women lingered long after the tour ended. They stood before the glass case, silent, gazing at the machines with an intensity that unsettled the attendants. Some leaned close, reading the faint inscriptions on the brass traces of initials, serial numbers, patent, marks worn smooth. One woman whispered, "My grandmother spoke of such things," before falling quiet again. Another touched her gloved fingers to the glass and murmured, "They made us the excuse for this." Outside, the city hummed with 1,000 new currents, tram lines, telephone wires, the endless chatter of the century's awakening. Yet here, in the museum's silent hall, the air felt heavier, older. The machines sat inert, stripped of their voltage, but not their history. They were artifacts now, archaeological proof of an era that had mistaken control for care. A young journalist from the Strand visited the exhibition and wrote a small, biting column: "The electric hysteria devices, relics of an age, both pious and perverse." It circulated widely. For the first time, the public read the word hysteria, not as illness, but as indictment. The tone was moral, almost repentant. These instruments reveal more about the male imagination than the female anatomy. Harland read the article from his quiet lodgings by the sea. The words stung, but not unfairly. He closed the paper and imagined those glass cases, the lights glinting off the brass like sunlight on graves. History, he realized, was not written by the cured, but by the curious. And curiosity, like shame, was never satisfied. It always dug deeper. The archaeology of shame had begun not in the soil of the earth, but in the ruins of conscience. And though the city would bury it again beneath new layers of industry and invention, it would surface each time someone asked the simplest question that science feared most. What, truly, were we healing? By 1907, the world had become addicted to its own current. Telegraph lines threaded through oceans, power plants bloomed along the Thames, and the first radio waves drifted invisibly through the air like whispers too soft for the century to yet understand. Every home, every street, every city hummed. And within that endless vibration, some said there lived a ghost. It began as rumor among the engineers at Battersea Power Station. They spoke of strange surges, fluctuations that followed no pattern, no fault in design. "It's like something alive in the lines," one technician whispered. "Something remembering." When the lights flickered late at night, they swore they heard a second rhythm beneath the machinery's roar, slower, steadier, almost human. Newspapers called it nonsense, but one story refused to die. A clerk claimed that, while repairing an old telegraph relay in Holborn, he received a message no one had sent. It was short, staccato, impossible to trace. "Tell them we were awake." The words were dismissed as a prank. Yet those who worked closest to the generators, the men who handled the current itself, knew better. They said the pulse had a memory, that every surge of power carried the echo of those who once trembled beneath it. Dr. Harland was an old man by then. His hair, once black, had thinned to silver, and his hands, once steady, trembled faintly even when still. He lived quietly in a seaside boarding house, the sort of place where no one asked questions. But even there, the ghost found him. The lights in his room flickered whenever he wrote. His lamp would dim, then brighten, as if the electricity itself were breathing with him. He told himself it was faulty wiring, but each night, when the sea wind howled through the window, he would sit in the dark and listen to the low, steady hum that had haunted his life, the note of progress and guilt intertwined. It was softer now, like a pulse fading through time. Yet, sometimes, beneath its rhythm, he thought he could hear voices faint, layered, thousands of them, not pleading, not suffering, speaking. He began to dream in sound. In his sleep, the city returned. The lamps flickering over fog-soaked cobblestones, the soft hiss of ether, the murmur of women's breath. He heard Clara Bellamy's voice light, defiant as she whispered through the static, "We were never ill." He saw Eleanor Murchison standing in a hall of light, surrounded by women, their faces calm, their hands unbound. The machines around them glowed not with shame, but with remembrance. When he awoke, his lamp was still glowing faintly, though he had not turned it on. The hum filled the room again, delicate, endless, no longer frightening. It seemed to say, "We have survived you." He rose slowly, crossed to the window, and looked out at the town. Below, every window illuminated, every street a river of light. The world had become his machine, vast, beautiful, unrepentant. The current ran through every wall, every wire, every heart. And in that unbroken brightness, the ghost of hysteria of every woman silenced, every doctor forgiven had found its home. It no longer haunted the living, it lived among them. Somewhere, deep within the wires, the hum continued, part grief, part prayer, part victory. The sound of awakening made eternal. By the first years of the new century's second decade, medicine had rebranded itself again. The word hysteria had vanished from textbooks, quietly replaced by neurasthenia or psychogenic fatigue. Professors spoke of nervous depletion now, of stress and imbalance. The diagnosis had changed its name the way a criminal changes his clothes. The illness had not died, it had only grown more polite. London had changed with it. The soot-dark buildings of Harlan's youth were cleaner now, their facades glowing beneath electric lamps. The city looked modern, but its heart remained familiar, a web of secrecy humming beneath refinement. Women in broad hats and tailored coats walked quickly through the streets, their faces composed, their voices firm. They carried not parasols but notebooks and petitions. The women's colleges were full, Parliament debated their rights. The age of obedience was ending, slowly, painfully. Eleanor Murchison's name appeared often in the papers now, spoken with both admiration and scorn. She had become the voice of what they called the rational body movement, a campaign to reclaim the history that men had medicalized. Her lectures drew crowds that filled the halls to capacity students, nurses, suffragists, even the occasional embarrassed doctor hiding in the back. She spoke of how an empire had once mistaken hunger for disease, and how it had built an industry to disguise that mistake. The diagnosis of desire, she said in one address, was never about healing. It was about containment. They called it hysteria so they would not have to call it loneliness. They named it illness so they would never have to ask what it meant. The lines spread like fire through the journals and pamphlets of the day. Men scoffed. Women memorized it. Harland, old and frail, read the transcript from his room by the sea. His eyesight was failing, the print blurred, but he knew every word by heart. He had heard her say it before, years ago, though neither of them had known what it meant then. He spent his final months writing a single essay, his confession in the only language he had ever known. It was not for publication. He titled it The Diagnosis of Desire. In it, he wrote, "We treated symptoms we could not name, fearing their resemblance to our own. We mistook the body's cry for reason as a defect to be silenced. The cure was never scientific, it was spiritual theft. We borrowed women's pain to build our careers. then called them healed when they stopped crying aloud. When he finished, he placed the pages in an envelope and addressed it to Eleanor Murchison. He never sent it. Instead, he left it on his desk beside the candle he had burned every evening since abandoning electricity. The next morning, the landlady found his room empty. The window was open, curtains fluttering in the salt wind. On the desk, beside the sealed letter, lay a single line written in his thin, unsteady hand. Desire was never the disease. It was the pulse that proved we were alive. Years later, when Eleanor spoke at a memorial for the forgotten women of 19th century medicine, she read that line aloud. The hall fell silent. Outside, the city buzzed with the sound of trolleys and wires and progress, the living heartbeat of a world still pretending to be cured. And somewhere in that ceaseless hum, the same one that had haunted Harlan's life, the echo of his words remained, threading through the wires, quiet but undeniable. The diagnosis of desire, she told them, had never belonged to doctors. It belonged to history itself, still trembling, still awake.